Hey guys, imagine waking up 20,000 years ago. No coffee, no Wi-Fi, and your idea of a hot date involves wrestling a saber-toothed cat for dinner. Welcome to the prehistoric dating scene, where romance was less about candlelit dinners and more about not getting eaten while you're trying to flirt. Today, we're diving into the most horrifying, jaw-dropping, and downright bizarre sex practices of prehistoric humans. Buckle up, because this is going to be a wild, cringe-inducing ride through the Stone Age bedroom. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Picture this. It's the Upper Paleolithic, and you're a personally Cro-Magnon with a unibrow that could double as a bird's nest. Your tribe's camped out in a cave somewhere in what's now France, and the closest thing you've got to Tinder is grunting at someone while you're both napping flint. Life is brutal, short, and smells like a mix of mammoth sweat and existential dread. The average lifespan is about 30 years, so if you're pushing 25, congratulations, you're basically the village elder. But don't get too cocky. Your teeth are rotting, your back hurts from hauling carcasses, and your idea of hygiene is splashing your face with river water that's probably 80% fish pee. Now, let's talk about love, or whatever passed for it back then. Prehistoric humans didn't have romantic comedies or love ballads to set the mood. Instead, they had survival instincts, questionable grooming habits, and a whole lot of desperation. The first thing you need to understand is that sex in the Stone Age wasn't just about passion or procreation. It was about survival. Your tribe needed babies to keep the population going, because half the kids didn't make it past age 5, thanks to disease, predators, or accidentally eating the wrong berries. So, mating was less, let's make sweet cluster roll love, and more, let's make sure the tribe doesn't go extinct before the next ice age. Let's start with the courtship rituals, or as I like to call them, how to woo someone when you both smell like a wet bison. Anthropologists have pieced together that prehistoric humans didn't exactly have a dating playbook. Instead, they relied on displays of strength, resourcefulness, and probably some awkward grunting. Imagine a guy showing off his best mammoth hunting spear to impress a potential mate. Look, Grog, I made this pointy stick myself. Want to see how it stabs? Smooth, right? Women, on the other hand, might have shown off their skills by weaving baskets or skinning a deer faster than anyone else. Nothing says marry me like a perfectly flayed hide, am I right? But here's where it gets weird, and trust me, it's about to get really weird. Some tribes had rituals that make modern speed dating look like a church picnic. In certain groups, men would compete in what we'll call pain games to prove their worth. Picture this, a bunch of hairy dudes standing in a circle, taking turns smacking each other with clubs or letting bees sting them to show they could handle pain. The winner? The guy who didn't pass out or cry for his mommy. If you're thinking, wow, that's hardcore, just wait, it gets worse. In some cultures, these pain games weren't just about impressing the ladies, they were a prerequisite for even being allowed to approach one. No pain, no gain, literally. Now, let's talk about the ladies for a second. While the men were out there trying to prove they could survive a bear attack, women in some tribes had their own rituals. Archaeologists have found evidence of body modification. Think scarification, tattoos, or even intentional bone breaking to create attractive deformities. In one particularly grim cave site in Spain, researchers found female skeletons with deliberately fractured toes, likely bound tightly during adolescence to create a specific foot shape. Why? Because apparently hobbling around in agony was the prehistoric equivalent of high heels. Imagine the pickup line, "Hey girl, those mangled toes are giving me life." Drop a comment below if you think you could have survived a prehistoric beauty standard like that. I want to hear how tough you are. Let's move on to the actual romance part, if you can call it that. Consent as we understand it today wasn't exactly a thing in the Stone Age. Tribes were small and social structures were rigid. In many cases, mating was less about mutual attraction and more about who had the most power or resources. The strongest hunter or the guy with the best cave might just decide who he's taking home. No questions asked. And if you're thinking, well, that sounds like a nightmare, you're not wrong. Women often had little say in the matter, and in some tribes the concept of marriage was more like a transaction. Here's a nice wolf pelt, Now you're my wife until one of us gets eaten by a hyena. Romantic, right? But it wasn't all grim. Some evidence suggests that certain tribes had surprisingly egalitarian setups. In these groups, men and women worked together on equal footing, and mating was more of a mutual agreement. Cave art from places like Lascaux shows men and women side by side, hunting and gathering as a team. Maybe, just maybe, there was a spark of something resembling affection in those moments. Two people sharing a roasted antelope leg under the stars, trying not to think about the inevitable saber-tooth attack. Speaking of cave art, let's talk about the prehistoric equivalent of not safe for work content. If you've ever seen those crude carvings of exaggerated body parts on cave walls, you know what I'm talking about. These weren't just doodles, they were full-on fertility symbols. Phalluses the size of tree trunks, vulvas carved so deep you could store your flint tools in them. This was the Stone Age version of Instagram thirst traps. Some researchers think these images were part of fertility rituals, meant to encourage reproduction in a world where survival was a coin toss. Others argue they were just prehistoric porn, because apparently, even 30,000 years ago, humans were obsessed with the same stuff we are today. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think those cave carvings were sacred art or just horny graffiti? I'm dying to know your take. Now let's dorsum to the really horrifying stuff, the rituals. In some tribes, sex wasn't just a private act, it was a public spectacle, purporting to be about fertility, but honestly, it feels more like desperation. Imagine a whole tribe gathered around a bonfire, chanting and drumming, while a couple is forced to perform in the middle of the camp. Why? To ensure the gods bless the union with babies, of course. Because nothing says divine approval like an audience of 20 people chewing on raw venison while you're trying to get it on. And don't even get me started on the sacred fluids thing. Some tribes believed that certain bodily substances had magical properties and would incorporate them into rituals. I'll spare you the details, but let's just say it wasn't exactly rose petals and champagne. If you're cringing right now, good, that's the appropriate response. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer awkwardness of these scenarios. You're trying to survive a world full of giant predators, starvation, and frostbite, and now you've got to deal with your entire extended family watching your every move. No pressure though, and if you think that's bad, consider the tribes that practice ritual deflowering. In some groups, the first sexual experience of a young person was a ceremonial event, often involving an older, experienced member of the tribe. The idea was to teach them the ropes, but let's be real. It was less about education and more about reinforcing tribal hierarchy. The more powerful you were, the more likely you were to be the designated teacher. Power dynamics in the Stone Age were about as subtle as a rock to the face. Speaking of rocks, let's talk about the tools of the trade. Prehistoric humans didn't have luxury boutiques or silk sheets, but they weren't above getting creative. Archaeologists have found polished stone objects that look suspiciously like, well, let's call them personal massagers. Were they for grinding herbs or something else entirely? We'll never know for sure, but the fact that they're always found in the back of caves, away from the communal fire, raises some eyebrows. And don't even get me started on the animal bones, because yes, some of those tools were carved Jologiria's mammoth tusks. Nothing says I'm a sophisticated lover like a handcrafted tusk toy. By now, you're probably wondering how anyone survived this nightmare of a dating scene. The answer? They didn't always. Childbirth was insanely dangerous, and without modern medicine, both mother and baby often didn't make it. Sex was a high-stakes gamble, and not just because of the emotional baggage. Infections, injuries, and the constant threat of death made every encounter a roll of the dice. And yet somehow, our ancestors kept at it, because here we are. So, hats off to their resilience, or maybe just their lack of better options. Before we wrap up this first part, let's talk about one more gem, the prehistoric equivalent of friends with benefits. In some tribes, polyamory wasn't just common, it was the norm. Why? Because sharing partners increased genetic diversity and strengthened tribal bonds. Sounds progressive, right? Well, not exactly. These arrangements were often less about free love and more about survival strategy. If everyone's hooking up with everyone else, it's harder for rival tribes to poach your people. Plus, it ensured that even if one guy got trampled by a woolly rhino, someone else could step in to keep the family line going. Practical, but not exactly the stuff of romance novels. Alright, that's part 1 of our journey into the horrifying, hilarious, and downright painful world of prehistoric sex practices. We've only scratched the surface, and trust me, it gets weirder from here. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these rituals shocked you the most. I'm betting it's the public performance thing, but I could be wrong. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive into the even darker corners of Stone Age romance, including some rituals that'll make your skin crawl. See you soon, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're enjoying this chaotic trip through history. Alright, let's dive back into the sweaty, gritty, and downright unhinged world of prehistoric sex practices. Part 2 of our wild ride through the Stone Age soap opera. If you thought part 1 was a roller coaster of cringe, buckle up, because the deeper we go, the weirder it gets. Picture yourself back in a cave 15,000 years ago, surrounded by flickering firelight, the stench of unwashed furs, and the distant howl of something that definitely wants to eat you. Romance? More like a survivalist's fever dream. Let's get into it. First up, let's talk about the bizarre world of prehistoric aphrodisiacs, or what passed for them when your pharmacy was a muddy riverbank. Modern folks might pop a pill or light a scented candle, but our ancestors? They were out there grinding up beetle shells, snorting crushed herbs that probably made them hallucinate woolly mammoths, and smearing animal fat on their skin to set the mood. Archaeologists have found traces of weird plant concoctions in ancient campsites, stuff like bitter roots or toxic berries that were likely used to get the blood pumping. Did they work? Maybe, but I'm betting the side effects included vomiting, delirium, or accidentally summoning the spirit of a very confused elk. Imagine trying to flirt while your date's tripping balls on some prehistoric Red Bull made from fermented moss. Drop a comment below. What's the worst thing you've ever tried to impress someone on a date? I need to know I'm not alone in my bad decisions. Now, let's get to the group dynamics, because things are about to take a turn for the communal. In some tribes, sex wasn't just a two-person affair, it was a team sport. We're talking full-on ritual orgies where the whole tribe got involved to appease the spirits or ensure a good harvest. Picture this: a freezing night, everyone huddled around a fire, and the tribal shaman's like, "Alright folks, the gods say we need to get freaky to make the deer come back." No one's arguing with the guy who claims he talks to the sky, so suddenly, it's a free-for-all. These weren't exactly Woodstock vibes, more like a mandatory company team-building exercise, but with way less HR oversight. The goal? Strengthen tribal unity and maybe trick the universe into sending more food. Did it work? Probably not, but it sure made for some awkward mornings around the campfire. And speaking of awkward, let's talk about the role of the elderly in these shenanigans. You'd think being old in the Stone Age meant sitting back with a cup of herbal sludge, complaining about the youth. Nope. In some tribes, elders were considered the ultimate relationship gurus, and they weren't just giving advice, they were involved. There's evidence from burial sites suggesting that older men and women sometimes took on mentorship roles in sexual rituals, especially for younger tribe members. Think of it as the world's worst internship program. Congratulations, you're now an adult. Here's Grandpa Grog to walk you through it. The idea was that experience equaled wisdom, but I'm guessing the real takeaway was lifelong trauma. If you're gagging right now, join the club. Let's shift gears to something even more horrifying: sacrifice-adjacent sex rituals. Some tribes didn't just stop at public performances or elder-led tutorials. They took things to a whole new level of what the actual hell. In certain groups, sex was tied to blood offerings or animal sacrifices, because nothing says, "let's get it" on like a freshly slaughtered boar. Archaeologists have found cave sites with weirdly specific setups, altars surrounded by animal bones smeared with ochre and ash, and, here's the kicker, traces of human blood. The theory? Some tribes believed that combining sex with sacrifice would supercharge their fertility, or appease whatever grumpy deity was in charge of the weather. Imagine trying to focus on romance while someone's chanting and waving a bloody antler over your head. Hard pass. Drop a comment and tell me, would you rather deal with a sacrificial altar or a modern blind date? I'm curious which nightmare you'd pick. Now let's talk about the role of superstition, because prehistoric humans were obsessed with it. Every aspect of life was governed by omens, spirits, and rituals, and sex was no exception. Some tribes believed that certain positions or locations, like doing it under a specific tree or during a full moon, would guarantee healthy babies or ward off evil spirits. Others thought that specific acts had to be performed at certain times, like during a solstice or after a successful hunt. Missed the timing? Congrats, you've just cursed your entire bloodline. No pressure, though. One particularly wild example comes from a site in Germany where archaeologists found a circle of stones arranged in a way that suggests it was a sacred sexy time spot. The stones were aligned with the stars, and there's evidence of charred bones and plant offerings nearby. So basically, you had to wait for the right constellation, light a fire, and hope you didn't screw up the cosmic vibe. Dating apps are looking pretty good right about now, huh? And then there's the issue of inbreeding, because let's face it, small tribes, limited options. With only a few dozen people in your group, your dating pool is basically your cousin's cousins, and that one guy who smells like he's been wrestling badgers. To avoid genetic disasters, some tribes got creative. They'd arrange mate swaps with neighboring groups, kind of like a prehistoric swingers party, but with higher stakes. These exchanges weren't just about diversifying the gene pool. They were diplomatic moves to prevent wars or secure alliances. Here, take my sister and don't raid our cave next week. Romantic? Not really. Effective? Well, we're still here, so maybe. But it wasn't all strategic trades and cosmic alignments. Some tribes took things to a level that makes even the most open-minded modern human raise an eyebrow. Let's talk about necrophilia. Yep, we're going there. There's evidence from a few sites, particularly in Eastern Europe, suggesting that some prehistoric groups didn't let death stop the party. Skeletons have been found posed in, shall we say, intimate positions, with tools and offerings placed in ways that scream ritual. Was it about honoring the dead, connecting with their spirits, or just straight up weirdness? No one knows for sure, but the fact that it happened at all is enough to make you question humanity's entire evolutionary journey. If you're feeling queasy, don't worry, we're moving on. Let's lighten the mood with something slightly less horrifying: prehistoric fashion as a mating strategy. You might think caveman and picture a loincloth and bad posture, but some of our ancestors were extra when it came to style. Excavations have uncovered shells, beads, and even feathers meticulously sewn into clothing or worn as jewelry. Why? To look hot, obviously. In a world where everyone's covered in dirt, a necklace made of wolf teeth or a cape of fox fur was the equivalent of a Rolex or a designer dress. Men and women alike would strut their stuff, hoping to catch the eye of someone who wasn't too busy fending off a bear. But here's the catch. Making these accessories took hours of work, and if you were spending all day stringing beads, you weren't hunting or gathering. So basically, you were betting your entire social status on looking fabulous. Sound familiar? Speaking of looking fabulous, let's talk about body hair. Today, we've got razors and waxing, but back then, you were rocking the full Sasquatch vibe, and it was a feature, not a bug. Some researchers think that thick body hair was a major turn-on, signaling health and warmth in a world where central heating meant huddling closer to the fire. In certain tribes, men and women might have gone out of their way to show off their luscious locks, think less shaved legs and more glorious armpit mane. Imagine the pickup line, "Hey babe, check out my pelt, wanna share a cave?" Drop a comment if you think you could rock the prehistoric hairy look. I'm betting some of you could pull it off. Now, let's get into the dark side of competition. Because when resources were scarce and survival was on the line, mating wasn't always a friendly game. In some tribes, men fought, sometimes to the death, for the right to a partner. We're not talking about a polite duel with swords. This was more like two guys bashing each other with rocks until one of them stopped moving. The winner got the girl, the loser got a concussion, or worse. And if you think that's brutal, consider the women who were sometimes caught in the crossfire. In extreme cases, rival tribes would raid each other's camps, kidnapping women to bolster their own numbers. It's less romantic getaway and more terrifying abduction. Suddenly, modern dating apps don't seem so bad, do they? Before we wrap up part 2, let's touch on one last nightmare: the role of pain and pleasure. Some tribes took the whole no pain, no gain thing to a whole new level. There's evidence of ritual piercings, brandings, and even genital modifications. Yes, you read that right. These weren't just for aesthetics. They were often tied to rites of passage or fertility beliefs. Imagine enduring a bone needle through your most sensitive bits just to prove you're ready for adulthood. And no, they didn't have anesthesia, just a stick to bite down on and a shaman muttering about spirits. If you're wincing right now, you're not alone. Alright, That's part 2 of our chaotic dive into the horrifying sex practices of prehistoric humans. We've covered orgies, sacrifices, and some truly questionable fashion choices, but there's still more madness to come. Drop a comment below and let me know which of these rituals made you want to time travel back to the present the fastest. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll explore even more absurd and terrifying corners of Stone Age romance. Hit that like button if you're still with me, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back to the prehistoric love jungle, where the only thing more dangerous than a saber-toothed cat is trying to navigate the absolute chaos of Stone Age romance. We're now in part 3 of our gut-wrenching, eyebrow-raising dive into the most horrifying sex practices of our ancestors. If you thought the last 2 parts were wild, brace yourself. This is where things get so bizarre you'll be thanking your lucky stars for modern dating disasters like ghosting or bad Tinder profiles. Let's jump right back into the cave, where the air smells like charred bones and regret, and the closest thing to a love song is the sound of someone sharpening a spear. First up, let's talk about the role of food in prehistoric hookups, because nothing screams sexy like a slab of half-cooked mammoth meat. In a world where starvation was always one bad hunt away, sharing food was the ultimate romantic gesture. Imagine a guy swaggering up to his crush with a bloody hunk of elk, like, "Hey, I killed this for you. Want to split it?" It's not exactly a box of chocolates, but in the Stone Age, it was practically a marriage proposal. Some tribes took this to the next level with ritual feasts, where food and sex were intertwined in ways that make modern dinner dates look tame. Picture this: a whole tribe gorging on roasted boar, passing around fermented fruit juice that's basically prehistoric moonshine, and then things escalate. These feasts were less about fine dining and more about survival bonding, with a side of "let's make babies before the next blizzard." Drop a comment below. What's the weirdest food you've ever tried to impress someone? I'm betting it's not as bad as raw mammoth liver. Now let's get into something truly unhinged, the role of violence as foreplay. Yeah, you heard that right. In some tribes, physical aggression wasn't just a way to settle disputes, it was a twisted form of flirtation. Archaeologists have found skeletal remains with healed fractures that suggest ritualized combat between potential mates. Think of it like a prehistoric version of playing hard to get, except instead of a coy text, you're getting whacked with a club. In certain groups, men and women would engage in mock battles where landing a solid hit was a sign of strength, and apparently, sex appeal. The winner might get respect, a mate, or just a concussion, but either way, it was a vibe. And if you're thinking, "That's insane," it gets worse. Some tribes had women fight each other for the honor of pairing up with the top hunter. Nothing says "I love you" like a black eye and a broken rib, right? Let's move on to the kids because, surprise, prehistoric parenting was just as messed up as their dating scene. In some tribes, children were raised communally, which sounds wholesome until you realize it was less about love and more about spreading the burden. With mortality rates sky high, parents couldn't afford to get too attached, so kids were often passed around like a shared Netflix account. But here's the kicker: some tribes introduced kids to sexual rituals way earlier than you'd expect. We're not talking full-on adult stuff, but there's evidence of adolescents being involved in preparatory ceremonies. Think dances or mock pairings to get them ready for the real deal. The idea was to ensure everyone knew their role in keeping the tribe alive, but it's hard not to cringe at the thought of a 13-year-old being told, "Alright kid, time to learn the birds and the bees, Stone Age style." If you're horrified, drop a comment and tell me how you'd explain that to a modern teenager. Now, let's talk about the ultimate power move, shamanic sex magic. Shamans weren't just the tribe's spiritual GPS, they were also the unofficial matchmakers, and boy, did they have some wild ideas. In some groups, shamans would orchestrate elaborate rituals where sex was used to channel divine energy or ward off bad juju. Picture a guy in a deer skull headdress, shaking a rattle made of turtle shells, while directing a couple to commune with the spirits in front of the whole tribe. These rituals often involved hallucinogenic plants, so everyone was probably seeing double while trying to follow the shaman's cryptic instructions. Yes, the great bison spirit demands you do it exactly at moonrise. Spoiler alert, the bison didn't care, but the shaman's ego sure did. And speaking of egos, let's dive into the world of polygamy and power dynamics. In many tribes, the strongest or most resourceful men didn't just have one partner, they had a whole roster. This wasn't about love, it was about status. The guy with the most kills or the best cave could claim multiple wives, which meant more kids and more influence. Sounds like a sweet deal for him, but for the women? Not so much. They were often treated as bargaining chips, traded between tribes to seal alliances or settle debts. And if you were a lower status guy, tough luck. You were stuck on the sidelines, hoping for a shot with someone who wasn't already claimed by the tribal MVP. It's like high school, but with more spears and fewer prom dates. But don't think women were always powerless. In some tribes, matriarchal structures flip the script. There's evidence from burial sites in what's now the Czech Republic, showing women buried with more grave goods than men. Think jewelry, tools, and even weapons. This suggests that some ladies were calling the shots, including in the mating game. These women might have chosen their partners based on skill, strength, or even how well they could dance during a ritual. Imagine a prehistoric bachelorette handing out wolf fangs instead of roses. Now that's a reality show I'd watch. Drop a comment if you think you'd have what it takes to win a Stone Age bachelorette's heart. Let's get into something straight out of a horror movie, ritual mutilation as a rite of passage. In some tribes, becoming an adult meant enduring body modifications that make modern piercings look like child's play. We're talking teeth filing, skull elongation, or, brace yourself, genital cutting. These weren't just for aesthetics. They were often tied to fertility or spiritual beliefs. For example, some groups believed that altering the body would make you more compatible with the gods or ensure better offspring. The process? A flint blade, no anesthesia, and a whole lot of screaming. Archaeologists have found skeletons with deliberately filed teeth or scarred pelvic bones, suggesting these practices were widespread. If you're clutching your pearls or your flint tools, you're not alone. Now, let's talk about the role of the environment, because Mother Nature was the ultimate third wheel in prehistoric romance. Caves, forests, and rivers weren't just backdrops, they were active players in the mating game. Some tribes believed certain locations were sacred for sex, like a specific cave or a hilltop under the stars. Why? Because they thought the spirits of the land would bless the union. But here's the reality. Caves are cold, damp, and full of bats, and forests are crawling with bugs and predators. Imagine trying to get romantic while swatting away mosquitoes the size of your fist or listening for the growl of a cave lion. Talk about a mood killer. And then there's the weather. Ice ages don't exactly scream date night. Huddling for warmth probably led to a lot of accidental hookups, because when it's minus 20 degrees Celsius, body heat is the best pickup line. Speaking of pickup lines, let's talk about prehistoric communication, or the lack thereof. Without a written language or even a complex spoken one, most flirting was probably nonverbal. Grunts, gestures, and maybe some suggestive cave drawings were the name of the game. Imagine trying to express "I'm into you" with a series of eyebrow wiggles and a poorly drawn stick figure. Some researchers think that music, or at least rhythmic drumming and chanting, played a role in courtship. Bone flutes dating back 40,000 years have been found in Europe, suggesting that our ancestors might have serenaded their crushes with haunting tunes. Picture a guy playing a bone flute under the moonlight, hoping his crush doesn't run off with the guy who's better at throwing rocks. Romantic in a please don't die tomorrow kind of way. Before we wrap up part 3, let's touch on one last nightmare, the role of death in sex. In some tribes, mourning and mating were bizarrely intertwined. There's evidence from burial sites suggesting that after a death, certain rituals involve sexual acts to honor the deceased or ensure their spirit moved on. This could mean anything from symbolic gestures to full-on ceremonies near the body. Why? Because prehistoric humans believed life and death were part of the same cycle, and sex was the ultimate act of creation to balance out loss. It's poetic in a deeply disturbing way. Alright, that's part 3 of our chaotic journey through the horrifying sex practices of prehistoric humans. We've covered violent flirtations, shamanic sex magic, and some truly gag-worthy rituals, but there's still one more layer of insanity to go. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these practices made you want to swear off dating forever. Stay tuned for part 4, where we'll wrap up this wild ride with the most shocking revelations yet. Hit that like button if you're still here, and I'll see you soon. Here we are, folks, at the grand finale of our gut-churning, mind-bending journey through the most horrifying sex practices of prehistoric humans. Part 4 is where we tie up this chaotic saga with a bow made of mammoth hide and existential dread. If you've made it this far, you deserve a medal, or at least a strong drink. Because we've already waded through public orgies, sacrificial altars, and rituals that make modern dating look like a fairy tale. Now, let's plunge into the final layer of Stone Age insanity, where love, survival, and sheer absurdity collide in ways that'll leave you questioning our species' sanity. Picture yourself one last time in a smoky cave, surrounded by flickering shadows, the stench of burnt fat, and the distant growl of something that definitely isn't a house cat. Let's finish this. First up, let's talk about the role of animals in prehistoric romance. Because yes, things are about to get that weird. In some tribes, animals weren't just food or clothing, they were spiritual wingmen. Certain groups believed that mimicking animal mating behaviors would make humans more fertile. Picture a bunch of Cro-Magnons prancing around like rutting deer, complete with antler headdresses and exaggerated grunts, all to channel the virility of a stag. Archaeologists have found cave paintings in places like Chauvet, France, showing humans and animals in suspiciously intimate poses. Not in a creepy way, we hope, but as part of rituals to harness animal potency. Imagine trying to keep a straight face while your buddy does his best bison impression to impress a date. Drop a comment below. What animal would you channel to up your dating game? I'm betting someone out there's picking a peacock. Now, let's dive into the world of fertility festivals, because prehistoric humans loved a good party, even if it was 90% panic and 10% fun. These weren't your average block parties with punch and balloons. They were high-stakes raves where the goal was to keep the tribe alive. In some groups, entire seasons were dedicated to fertility, with days-long ceremonies involving dancing, chanting, and you guessed it, a whole lot of hooking up. The catch? These festivals often coincided with major hunts, so you'd have a bunch of exhausted, blood-splattered hunters stumbling back from killing a mammoth, only to be told, "Great job, now get to the baby making." No rest for the wicked, apparently. Evidence from sites in Russia shows massive bonfire pits surrounded by animal bones and fertility figurines, suggesting these events were the prehistoric equivalent of Coachella, but with higher stakes and worse hygiene. Speaking of figurines, let's talk about those famous Venus statues, the chubby, exaggerated carvings of women that pop up all over prehistoric Europe. You've probably seen them: big hips, massive breasts, and faces that look like they were carved by someone who'd never actually seen a human. Some researchers think these were fertility idols, meant to represent the ideal mother figure. Others? They're betting these were the Stone Age version of pin-up posters, carved by lonely hunters with too much time on their hands. Either way, these statues were often found near ritual sites, suggesting they played a role in mating ceremonies. Imagine a guy nervously clutching his Venus figurine like it's a lucky charm while trying to flirt. I made you this rock lady. Wanna hang out? Romantic, right? Drop a comment and tell me. Do you think these Venus statues were sacred or just prehistoric thirst traps? I'm dying to hear your take. Now, let's get into something truly grim. The role of captivity in mating. We touched on tribal raids before, but some groups took it to another level. In extreme cases, women captured from rival tribes weren't just integrated. They were forced into roles as wives for the victors. This wasn't about love or even strategy. It was about domination and boosting numbers. Skeletons from sites in what's now Ukraine show signs of trauma consistent with violent abductions, and some burials suggest these women were treated as property rather than partners. It's a brutal reminder that the Stone Age wasn't all cave art and cozy campfires. Survival often meant doing whatever it took, no matter how horrifying. If you're feeling a chill down your spine, that's the appropriate response. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Some tribes had surprisingly tender practices, at least by prehistoric standards. There's evidence from burial sites in Italy where couples were buried together, their skeletons carefully arranged to suggest they were holding hands or facing each other. These burials hint at genuine bonds, maybe even love, in a world where survival left little room for sentimentality. Picture two people who weathered blizzards, predators, and the occasional bad batch of berries, choosing to face eternity side by side. It's almost sweet, until you remember they probably smelled like a mix of sweat and charred reindeer. Still, it's a rare glimpse of humanity in a time when life was mostly pain and panic. Let's talk about the role of taboos, because even prehistoric humans had their version of "don't do that, it's weird." In some tribes, certain sexual acts or partners were off limits, not because of morality, but because of superstition. For example, some groups believed that mating during a thunderstorm would anger the spirits and bring bad luck. Others thought that certain family members, like a sibling's spouse, were untouchable to avoid cosmic retribution. Breaking these taboos could mean exile, which was basically a death sentence when you're surrounded by wolves and frostbite. Imagine getting kicked out of your tribe because you got frisky during a lightning storm. Talk about bad timing. And then there's the issue of birth control, or the complete lack thereof. Prehistoric humans didn't have condoms or pills, but they weren't clueless. Some tribes used herbal concoctions, like silphium-like plants, to try and prevent pregnancy. Did they work? Probably about as well as a modern-day pull and pray strategy. Other groups practiced abstinence during certain times, like when food was scarce, to avoid bringing kids into a starving tribe. But let's be real, when you're stuck in a cave with nothing but time and body heat, abstinence wasn't exactly a popular choice. The result? A lot of babies, a lot of risk, and a whole lot of praying to whatever deity was on duty that week. Now, let's get to the weirdest part yet, the role of the supernatural. Some tribes believe that sex could literally connect you to the spirit world. In certain rituals, shamans would guide couples through acts meant to commune with ancestors or gods. This could involve anything from chanting and dancing to, yep, you guessed it, trippy plant brews that made you see visions of glowing bison. One site in Siberia revealed a bizarre setup, a circle of skulls, both human and animal, arranged around a fire pit with traces of what looks like a hallucinogenic resin. The theory? The tribe was trying to channel their ancestors' fertility through some next-level psychedelic sex magic. Imagine trying to focus on romance while you're tripping so hard you think your partner's a cave bear. Hard pass. Speaking of hard passes, let's talk about the physical toll of all this. Prehistoric sex wasn't just emotionally and socially complicated, it was dangerous. Without modern hygiene, infections were a constant threat. Childbirth was a gamble, with sky-high mortality rates for both mother and baby. And let's not forget the injuries from those romantic combat rituals or the infections from poorly done body modifications. Every encounter was a roll of the dice, and the house usually won. Yet, somehow, our ancestors kept at it, because giving up wasn't an option. Hats off to their stubbornness, I guess. Before we close out, let's reflect on one last thing, the legacy of all this madness. Every weird ritual, every painful rite, every awkward cave hookup led to us. You, me, and everyone watching this video. Our ancestors' bizarre, horrifying, and occasionally touching mating practices are why humanity's still here, for better or worse. So, next time you're swiping on a dating app or stressing about a first date, just be glad you're not trying to flirt while dodging a woolly rhino or appeasing the great bison spirit. We've come a long way, haven't we? Alright, that's the end of our wild, cringe-inducing journey through the most horrifying sex practices of prehistoric humans. From animal cosplay to psychedelic rituals, we've covered it all, and I hope you're as simultaneously fascinated and disturbed as I am. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these prehistoric nightmares stuck with you the most. I'm betting it's the skull circle, but I could be wrong. If you enjoyed this chaotic ride, hit that like button and subscribe for more dives into the absurd corners of history. Thanks for sticking with me, and I'll see you next time for another trip into the past, hopefully with less trauma. Stay curious and stay safe out there. Hey guys, imagine being a samurai in feudal Japan, slicing through enemies with a katana sharper than your mother-in-law's tongue, only to go home and face a whole different kind of battlefield, your personal life. Welcome to the secret, sweaty, and downright bizarre world of samurai behind closed doors, where honor meets hormones and the Bushido code doesn't quite cover what happens after dark. Today, we're peeling back the tatami mats to reveal the wild, cringe-worthy, and sometimes heartbreaking realities of samurai intimacy. Buckle up, because this is going to be a sharp, sarcastic ride through medieval Japan's most private moments. Before you settle in with your sake, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you're ready for more historical chaos. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing who's joining me on this wild journey. Now grab a fan, dim the lights, and let's dive into the scandalous underbelly of samurai life. Picture this, it's the Sengoku period, around the 16th century, and you're a samurai. By day, you're a walking arsenal, draped in armor, ready to die for your lord faster than you can say seppuku. But when the sun sets and you limp back to your modest estate, probably smelling like horse sweat and existential dread, you're just a guy, trying to navigate the minefield of family, relationships, and yes, sex. Life as a samurai wasn't all glorious battles and poetic haikus. It was a high-stakes game of survival, and your personal life was just as messy as the battlefield. Let's start with the basics: samurai marriage. You'd think a warrior with a sword collection and a death wish would have his pick of partners, but nope. Love was about as romantic as a rice tax negotiation. Marriages were arranged, often before you could grow a decent mustache. Your bride? Probably chosen by your parents or your lord to cement an alliance or keep the clan's honor intact. Imagine meeting your wife for the first time on your wedding day, her face hidden behind a fan, and you're both thinking, well, this is awkward, but at least we're not dead yet. The goal was simple: produce heirs to carry on the family name, because nothing says legacy like a kid who'll inherit your debts and your enemies. But here's the kicker: divorce was rare, and cheating could cost you your head, so you were stuck with this stranger for life, whether you liked it or not. Drop a comment. Would you survive an arranged marriage, or would you be plotting your escape by day 2? Now, let's talk about the samurai household, because it was less happy family and more dysfunctional reality show. Your wife ran the show at home. Think of her as the CFO of your crumbling estate. While you were out swinging your katana, she was managing the budget, raising the kids, and making sure the servants didn't steal the last of the rice. Sounds empowering, right? Well, not quite. Her power came with a catch. She was expected to be the perfect wife, mother, and accountant, all while staying loyal to a guy who might not come back from the next battle. And if you died, she'd either shave her head and become a nun or remarry to keep the clan's alliances tight. Romance? More like a contract with extra steps. Oh, and let's not forget the in-laws. Your wife's family could be your biggest allies or your worst nightmare, constantly meddling to make sure their daughter wasn't married to a total loser. Good luck impressing them when your best asset is a slightly dented helmet. Speaking of assets, let's get to the bedroom, or rather, the futon. Samurai didn't exactly have candlelit dinners or rose petals to set the mood. Their homes were drafty, the walls were paper thin, and privacy was a fantasy. You're trying to get romantic, but your kids are snoring 2 feet away, your mother-in-law's eavesdropping, and there's a 50% chance a rival clan's ninja is hiding in the ceiling. Sexy, right? Plus, samurai were obsessed with discipline, so even their intimate moments were probably scheduled like a military campaign. Alright, darling, it's 9 p.m., time to fulfill our marital duties. Let's make this quick before the next war council. And don't expect much foreplay. These guys were trained to cut to the chase, literally and figuratively. But here's where it gets spicy. And by spicy, I mean straight up weird. Samurai had access to pillow books, basically medieval Japan's version of a sex manual, complete with tips, tricks, and some truly questionable illustrations. These books, like the famous Shijuhate, 48 techniques, weren't just about technique, they were about turning intimacy into an art form, because apparently even sex had to follow the Bushido code. Imagine your samurai husband pulling out a scroll and saying, "Hold on, let me check position 37, the graceful crane. I think we're doing it wrong." If you're laughing, you're not alone. Drop a comment. Would you trust a 500-year-old sex manual, or are you sticking to modern advice? Now, let's talk about the side hustle of samurai romance, concubines and courtesans. If you were a high-ranking samurai, you might have a mistress or two on the side, because apparently honor didn't extend to monogamy. These women were often from lower classes, or even the floating world of geishas and courtesans, trained to entertain with music, poetry, and, well, other skills. But don't get it twisted, this wasn't some glamorous affair. Concubines were often stuck in a weird limbo, valued for their beauty but rarely respected, and their kids? They might inherit a sword but never the family name. Meanwhile, the wife at home was expected to just deal with it, because questioning her husband's needs was about as wise as challenging him to a duel. The double standards were thicker than a samurai's armor. And speaking of armor, let's talk about the physical toll of being a samurai in the bedroom. These guys were in peak fighting shape, sure, but they were also riddled with scars, bad knees, and the kind of stress that comes from knowing your lord might order you to disembowel yourself tomorrow. Plus, hygiene wasn't exactly a priority. Bathing was a luxury, and deodorant wasn't invented yet. Imagine trying to get close to someone who smells like a mix of sweat, horse, and old blood. Perfume? Nah, you're lucky if they splashed some sack on their neck and called it a day. And don't even get me started on dental hygiene. Those wooden toothpicks weren't cutting it against a diet of rice and raw fish. Let's pivot to the women, because samurai wives had their own struggles. They were expected to embody the ideal of Yamato Nadeshiko, graceful, loyal, and tougher than a bamboo spear. These women weren't just sitting around embroidering kimonos. They were trained in combat, often wielding naginata, those scary pole weapons, to defend the home when their husbands were off getting skewered. If the castle was attacked, she was the last line of defense and she was expected to go down swinging, or commit ritual suicide to avoid capture. Talk about pressure. And yet, these women still had to keep the spark alive in a marriage that was more about politics than passion. Imagine trying to flirt with your husband while sharpening your blade and praying he doesn't bring home another concubine. Drop a comment. Could you handle the life of a samurai wife, or would you be sneaking off to join the ninjas? Now, let's get to the really dark stuff, the role of honor in the bedroom. Samurai lived by Bushido, a code that demanded loyalty, duty, and self-control, but it also created some seriously warped dynamics. For example, if a samurai suspected his wife of infidelity, he could kill her and her lover without a second thought. Honor demanded it. Evidence? Who needs it when you've got a sword and a bad mood? Women, meanwhile, had zero recourse. If your husband was cheating, you just had to smile and serve the tea. And if you were caught even looking at another guy, best case, you're divorced and disgraced. Worst case, you're a head shorter. The stakes were higher than a shogun's ego, and the paranoia was real. Speaking of paranoia, let's talk about the constant threat of betrayal. Samurai families were often caught in political webs, where one wrong move could mean execution or exile. Your wife might be spying for her family's clan, your mistress might be a plant from a rival lord, and even your kids could be used as pawns in a power grab. Intimacy wasn't just personal, it was a potential security breach. Imagine trying to whisper sweet nothings while wondering if your partner's secretly plotting to sell you out to the daimyo. Trust issues? Samurai invented them. Before we wrap up this first part, let's touch on one more gem, the role of poetry in seduction. Samurai weren't just warriors, they were expected to be cultured, which meant mastering arts like calligraphy and poetry. Some used waka or tanka, those short, flowery poems, to woo their partners. Picture a grizzled samurai, fresh from battle, scribbling a 31-syllable poem about cherry blossoms and longing, hoping it'll win over his wife's cold shoulder. It's almost cute, until you remember he probably wrote it while nursing a stab wound. Did it work? Maybe, but I'm betting his wife was more impressed by a new kimono than a metaphor about fleeting dew. Alright, that's part 1 of our wild dive into the secret life of samurai behind closed doors. We've covered arranged marriages, concubines, and the stench of feudal romance. But trust me, it gets even weirder from here. Drop a comment and tell me which part of samurai life shocked you the most. I'm guessing it's the pillow books, but I could be wrong. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dig deeper into the chaos, betrayal, and downright bizarre rituals of Japan's warrior class. Hit that like button if you're enjoying this, and I'll see you soon. Alright, let's slice back into the steamy, sword-filled soap opera of samurai life behind closed doors, part 2 of our wild ride through feudal Japan's most scandalous secrets. If you thought part 1 was a chaotic mix of arranged marriages and questionable hygiene, brace yourself, because we're diving deeper into the absurdity, paranoia, and straight-up bizarre practices that made samurai romance a battlefield all its own. Picture yourself in a creaky wooden house, the air thick with incense and tension, your katana leaning against the wall, and the constant threat of betrayal lurking like a ninja in the shadows. Let's get to it. First up, let's talk about the role of geishas and courtesans in samurai life, because these women were more than just sidekicks. They were the rock stars of the floating world. High-ranking samurai often frequented the pleasure districts, like Yoshiwara in Edo, where geishas and courtesans offered music, dance, and, let's be honest, a lot more. These women were trained to be witty, charming, and skilled in ways that made your average samurai wife's naginata lessons look tame. But here's the catch. Visiting a courtesan wasn't just a fling, it was a status symbol. Dropping a small fortune on a night in Yoshiwara was like flaunting a Rolex, except this Rolex could play the shamisen and break your heart. The downside? These relationships were transactional, and falling in love was a rookie mistake. Many samurai went broke chasing a courtesan's smile, only to realize she was playing the same game with every other warrior in town. Drop a comment. Would you risk your entire rice stash for a night in the floating world? Or are you keeping your coins for a new sword? Now, let's talk about the samurai's obsession with lineage, because producing an heir was less about family cuddles and more about securing your clan's future. If your wife wasn't delivering a son, and it had to be a son, because feudal Japan wasn't exactly feminist utopia, you were in trouble. Some samurai resorted to extreme measures like adopting a promising young warrior, or even borrowing a kid from a relative to pass off as their own. But here's where it gets wild. In some cases, samurai turned to concubines specifically to produce heirs, because their wives were under too much pressure to perform. Imagine the family dinner, your wife's glaring at you, the concubines awkwardly sipping tea, and the kids just trying to figure out who's in charge. It's like a medieval sitcom, but with more seppuku threats. Speaking of threats, let's dive into the dark side of samurai intimacy, the constant specter of violence. Bushido demanded loyalty, but it also bred paranoia. If a samurai suspected his wife or concubine of disloyalty, things could get ugly fast. We're talking duels, executions, or even forcing the woman to commit ritual suicide to restore honor. And it wasn't just the women at risk. Samurai men could face punishment for stepping out of line too. If you got caught with the wrong person, like, say, your lord's favorite courtesan, you might find yourself exiled or worse. One famous story from the Kamakura period tells of a samurai who was forced to commit seppuku after a scandalous affair with a rival's wife. His last words? Probably something like, totally worth it. Drop a comment. What's the worst relationship drama you've ever heard of? Modern or historical? I'm betting the samurai have you beat. Now, let's get to the bedroom rituals, because samurai didn't just follow pillow books. They had some seriously weird superstitions. Some believed that certain days or times were luckier for conception, based on lunar cycles or Shinto rituals. Miss the auspicious night? Congrats, you've angered the gods, and now your kid might be born with bad karma. Others used talismans or charms like tiny wooden carvings or inscribed scrolls to boost fertility or ward off evil spirits. Imagine trying to get in the mood while your wife's chanting a prayer and waving a lucky bamboo stick over the futon. And don't even think about skipping the post-coital purification rituals, bathing in cold water or burning incense to cleanse any spiritual impurities. Romance? More like a spiritual obstacle course. Let's talk about the women again, because samurai wives deserve a medal for putting up with this nonsense. These ladies were expected to be loyal, fertile, and ready to fight off invaders, all while keeping the household running like a well-oiled war machine. But they weren't just passive players. Some samurai women got creative with their influence. There's evidence of wives acting as spies or negotiators, using their position to gather intel or broker deals between clans. One famous example is Tomoe Gozen, a warrior woman from the Genpei War, who wasn't just a badass on the battlefield, but also a key player in her husband's political schemes. Imagine being married to a woman who could outwit you, outfight you, and probably outdrink you. Respect. Drop a comment. Who's the most badass historical woman you know of, and why? I'm all ears. Now, let's get into something truly bizarre, the role of same-sex relationships in samurai culture. Yep, we're going there. In feudal Japan, particularly during the Edo period, same-sex relationships between samurai were not only common, but often celebrated as a form of bonding. Known as shudo, these relationships typically involved an older samurai mentoring a younger one, and let's just say the mentorship wasn't limited to swordplay. These bonds were seen as honorable, even spiritual, and were often formalized with vows or contracts. But don't get it twisted, this wasn't about equality. The power dynamic was strict, with the older samurai calling the shots, and the younger one expected to show absolute loyalty. It's like a bromance, but with more poetry and fewer fist bumps. The catch? These relationships were supposed to end when the younger samurai came of age, often leading to heartbreak or awkward transitions to just friends. Imagine breaking up with your mentor because you turned 20. Talk about a midlife crisis at 19. Speaking of crises, let's talk about the physical toll of samurai life on romance. These guys were built like tanks, but years of combat left them battered. Scars, missing fingers, and chronic pain were standard, and that's before you factor in the psychological toll of constant war and the ever-looming threat of ritual suicide. Intimacy was often rushed or perfunctory. because who has time for romance when you might have to disembowel yourself by sunrise? And for the women, childbirth was a gamble. Maternal mortality was high, and medical care was basically a guy with some herbs and a prayer. Every pregnancy was a roll of the dice, and the stakes were life or death. Yet, somehow, these couples kept at it because giving up wasn't in the samurai playbook. Let's pivot to the role of religion, because Shinto and Buddhism had a massive influence on samurai intimacy. Some samurai believed that sexual restraint was a path to spiritual purity, leading to periods of abstinence before battles or major rituals. Others went the opposite route, using sex as a way to connect with the divine. Think tantric vibes, but with more sake and fewer yoga poses. Temples sometimes doubled as meeting spots for clandestine affairs, because nothing says forbidden love like sneaking around under the watchful eyes of a 1,000-armed cannon statue. And if you got caught, you'd better hope the gods were feeling merciful, because your lord sure wasn't. Before we wrap up part 2, let's touch on one more wild aspect, the role of gift-giving in seduction. Samurai didn't just rely on poetry to woo their partners, they used gifts to seal the deal. A finely crafted fan, a lacquered box, or even a horse could be a romantic gesture, but it came with strings attached. Gifts were often a way to show off wealth or secure loyalty, especially with concubines or courtesans. Imagine your husband coming home with a shiny new dagger for you, but the subtext is, please don't stab me when I visit the pleasure district. And for women, giving gifts to their husbands, like a hand-stitched kimono, could be a subtle power play, reminding him who's keeping the household together. It's less I love you and more don't forget who's boss. Alright, that's part 2 of our chaotic dive into the secret life of samurai behind closed doors. We've covered geishas, same-sex bonds, and the paranoia-fueled world of feudal romance, but there's still more madness to come. Drop a comment and let me know which of these samurai secrets shocked you the most. I'm betting it's the Shudo relationships, but I could be wrong. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll explore even darker corners of Japan's warrior class, from ritual punishments to the weirdest bedroom superstitions yet. Hit that like button if you're still with me, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back to the shadowy sake-soaked drama of samurai life behind closed doors, part 3 of our wild dive into the secret world of feudal Japan's warrior class. If you thought the last 2 parts were a roller coaster of arranged marriages, courtesan chaos, and paranoia sharper than a katana's edge, hold on to your top knot, because we're about to plunge into the weirdest, darkest, and most absurd corners yet. Picture yourself in a dimly lit room, the air heavy with incense and the weight of 1,000 unwritten rules, your sword within reach, and the constant fear that one wrong move could cost you everything. Let's dive in. First up, let's talk about the role of secrecy in samurai relationships, because nothing says romance like sneaking around in a world where getting caught means a one-way ticket to seppuku. Samurai households were like espionage hubs. Everyone was watching everyone else. Your wife might be loyal, but her maids probably reporting back to her family. Your concubine could be a spy for a rival clan. Even the kids were potential snitches, raised to prioritize clan loyalty over family ties. Intimacy was a minefield, and affairs had to be conducted with ninja-level stealth. Some samurai went to insane lengths to keep their secrets, like meeting lovers in remote temples or exchanging coded messages disguised as poetry. Imagine slipping your mistress a haiku that says, "Cherry blossoms fall, meet me by the river at dusk, don't tell my wife." Romantic? Sure, until you realize one misplaced syllable could get you both beheaded. Drop a comment. What's the sneakiest thing you've ever done for love? Or would you rather face a samurai's wrath than try? Now, let's get into the bizarre world of samurai beauty standards, because looking good in feudal Japan was a full-time job. For men, it was all about the top knot. Your chon mage had to be perfect, oiled and tied just right, or you were basically a social pariah. A sloppy top knot was like showing up to a duel in flip-flops. For women, the ideal was pale skin, blackened teeth, yes, really, and eyebrows shaved off and redrawn higher on the forehead. This look, called ohaguro, was considered peak hotness, but let's be honest, it's giving vampire vibes in the worst way. Samurai wives spent hours painting their faces with white lead powder, which was basically poison, just to look like the ghostly ideal of beauty. And don't even think about skipping the kimono. Wearing the wrong color or pattern could signal disloyalty, or worse, bad taste. Imagine trying to flirt when your teeth are blacker than your soul, and your face is a walking health hazard. Drop a comment. Could you rock the Ohaguro look, or are you sticking to modern makeup? Speaking of health hazards, let's talk about the physical dangers of samurai intimacy. Sex in feudal Japan wasn't just awkward, it was risky. Without modern medicine, infections were a constant threat, and childbirth was like playing Russian roulette with a midwife who's armed with nothing but boiling water and good intentions. Samurai women faced brutal odds. Maternal mortality was high, and even a successful birth could leave you weakened for months. Men weren't off the hook either. Venereal diseases were rampant, especially among samurai who frequented the pleasure districts. And yet, the pressure to produce heirs meant you couldn't just take a break. Imagine trying to keep the spark alive when every pregnancy feels like a death sentence, and your husband's latest trip to Yoshiwara might have brought back more than just memories. It's enough to make you want to swear off romance and join a monastery. Let's pivot to the role of rituals, because samurai didn't just pray for victory. They prayed for everything, including their love lives. Shinto and Buddhist rituals were woven into every aspect of intimacy, from conception to childbirth. Some couples visited shrines to pray for fertility, leaving offerings of rice or sake to appease the gods. Others consulted astrologers to pick the perfect day for marital activities, because nothing kills the mood like knowing Jupiter's in retrograde. One particularly wild ritual involved burning specific herbs during intimacy to ward off evil spirits. Imagine trying to focus while your room smells like a forest fire and your wife's muttering incantations. And if you thought that was extra, some samurai believed that certain sexual positions could influence the baby's gender or strength. Spoiler alert, they didn't, but it sure made for some awkward experimentation. Drop a comment. What's the weirdest superstition you've ever heard of? And would you try it for a samurai-level heir? Now, let's get into the juicy stuff. Political marriages and their fallout. Samurai didn't just marry for love or even heirs. They married to keep the clan's power intact. A bad match could tank your family's status, while a good one could secure you a castle or two. But these alliances were a double-edged sword. Your new wife might be a political asset, but she could also be a spy, feeding info back to her family. And if her clan fell out of favor, tough luck. You're now tied to a sinking ship. Some samurai tried to game the system by marrying multiple women from different clans, creating a web of alliances that was less happily ever after and more Game of Thrones with extra kimonos. The drama was endless: jealous wives, scheming, in-laws, and kids caught in the crossfire of clan politics. Imagine your family reunion being a tense negotiation where everyone's armed and nobody trusts the Seiko. Speaking of kids, let's talk about how samurai raised their heirs, because it was less loving parent and more drill sergeant with a vendetta. From a young age, samurai children were groomed for war, loyalty, and survival. Boys were trained in swordsmanship and bushido, often sent to live with other families to toughen them up or secure alliances. Girls were taught to manage households and, if necessary, fight like their mothers. But here's the dark twist. Kids were also pawns in the marriage game. Betrothals were arranged as early as age 5, locking kids into alliances before they could even spell katana. Imagine being a kid, playing with a wooden sword, only to be told you're engaged to some stranger from a rival clan. Childhood? More like a crash course in geopolitics. Let's get into something straight out of a fever dream: the role of dreams in samurai intimacy. Some samurai believed dreams were messages from the gods, guiding their decisions in love and war. If you dreamed of a crane or a cherry blossom, it might be a sign to pursue a particular match. If you dreamed of a snake, bad news, your lover might be cursed. Some even consulted dream interpreters who'd analyze your visions for clues about your romantic future. Picture a samurai waking up in a cold sweat, muttering, "I saw a turtle in my dream. Does that mean I should propose or run?" It's absurd, but in a world where a bad omen could mean death, you didn't mess around with turtle dreams. And speaking of omens, let's talk about the role of death in samurai relationships. Death wasn't just a possibility, it was a lifestyle. Samurai lived with one foot in the grave, and that shaped their approach to intimacy. Some couples made pacts to die together if their lord fell, a romantic but horrifying commitment called junshi. Others prepared for the inevitable by writing death poems, even for their partners, as a way to say goodbye. Imagine your spouse handing you a poem that says, "When I fall in battle, Meet me in the next life under the cherry blossoms. It's poetic, sure, but also a grim reminder that your next date might be in the afterlife. Before we wrap up part 3, let's touch on one more wild aspect, the role of food in seduction. Samurai didn't just share sake, they used food as a power play. A lavish meal could signal wealth and status, impressing a potential lover or ally. Some samurai wives went all out, preparing intricate dishes like grilled eel or pickled plums to win over their husbands or guests. But here's the catch. Food was scarce during wartime, so serving a feast was like flexing your entire rice harvest. And if you were a concubine, you'd better hope your cooking skills were as good as your charm, because a bad meal could land you back in the pleasure district. Imagine trying to seduce someone with a bowl of millet porridge while your rival's serving sashimi. Tough competition. Alright, that's part 3 of our chaotic journey into the secret life of samurai behind closed doors. We've covered sneaky affairs, deadly childbirth, and the weirdest superstitions yet, but there's still one more layer of madness to go. Drop a comment and tell me which of these samurai secrets made you want to time travel back to the present. My money's on the black teeth trend. Stay tuned for part 4, where we'll wrap up this wild ride with the most shocking revelations yet. Hit that like button if you're still here, and I'll see you soon. 10 seconds. A man with more wives than sense wakes up, consults 3 soothsayers, 2 astrologers, and a confused goat, and still can't remember which palace corridor leads to the throne. Welcome to polygamy, power, and the peculiar math of kingship, where one crown equals many problems, and everyone's survival strategy starts with learning how to smile at the right person and sharpen a dagger with the other hand. If you're watching, type 17 in the comments. Tell me whether you'd choose wife 17's cunning, wife 3's diplomacy, or wife 1's appetite for disaster. Now breathe. This is where the nightmare of history gets glamorous, dangerous, and oddly hilarious. The king's morning is a careful choreography of clothes, courtiers, and contingency. He awakes to the scent of incense, an olfactory memo. There are eyes in every shadow and a rumor in every cup. His first task is never the state ledger or the troop rolls. It is, more practically, the inventory of people who can undermine him before breakfast. The ambitious wife with a smile like a trapdoor. The crown prince who learned chess when others learned to tie their sandals. The general who thinks in marching, orders and betrayals. The midwife who knows secrets that can unmake a throne. A monarch in these times is less a ruler and more an overworked ringmaster in a circus where every act hails a different animal. Polygamy, for these kings, is not a romantic idea, but an institutional solution. An analog of strategic alliances, matrimonial treaties, and a bizarre, human-shaped insurance policy. Take the story of King Temba, who declared marriage to 3 sisters to secure an alliance with a neighboring clan. It was meant to be pragmatic. 3 marriages, 1 political buffer. Instead, it became a court war so complicated it required maps. Imagine the poetry of ledger entries. Dawn, kiss with sister A. Noon, dance with sister B. Remind steward to note alibis. The sisters, for their part, converted marriage into a board game of influence. They traded favors like chips, cultivated spies disguised as hairdressers, and learned the king's calendar better than the king himself. Within a year, the alliance that was supposed to secure borders had secured a thriving black market of court gossip. Power in these courts is not distributed in tidy fractions. It leaks, it coagulates, it forms cliques like stubborn oil. A queen's real power seldom lay in the title, great wife, but in her ability to make people inconveniently necessary, to be the person who wrote the king's favorite poems, who baked the one cookie that moved his mood, who knew the exact hour he feared. Influence is a craft. Some women mastered it by cultivating laughter at the right time. Others became masters by making themselves the only person who could feed the king when he was ill. The woman who prepared his herbal broth suddenly controlled appointments, favors, and in the sad arithmetic of court, futures. Then there is the business of heirs. Succession is a headache that requires both patience and knives. Kings married to multiple women often left a crowded morgue of candidates for the crown. Without a clear, codified succession, every prince must become a diplomat, a soldier, and a spy. The heir must cultivate a coalition that reaches beyond the palace to the provinces, the market stalls, and the hungry men with spears who decide which side of history will stand. Princes learned early that a meal with the right merchant, A well-placed promise to a provincial chief or a whispered rumor in the barracks could be more decisive than any genius on the battlefield. The external wars were often simpler than the wars at home. The enemy outside had the courtesy of that simple desire to conquer. The enemy inside had the audacity to smile at you while sharpening a rumor. Listen to the tale of Prince Kofi, who could recite war treaties in sleep, but could not recognize a whisper about his mother's origins. He lost the crown not to a stronger army, but to a rumor about his bloodline, planted by a concubine whose ambitions were large and whose loyalty was fungible. She made herself indispensable to a general who needed her songs to soothe his troops, and in return she offered a story that transformed the prince's legitimacy into a shade of doubt. Kofi's followers, once robust as drumbeats, thinned into a chorus of excuses. He learned the hardest lesson kings and princes learn. Legitimacy is part legal document, part public imagination, and entirely susceptible to narrative intervention. Power games extended beyond the palace walls and into the lives of ordinary people, who turned survival into its own form of politics. Farmers learned to time their harvests not only with the rains, but with the king's visits. A field swept by royal procession might receive favor or requisition depending on who rode in front. A market stall with the right gossip could get a guest quota at court or an order of grain. Survival was not simply about producing food, but about producing stories. Stories that could be sold, lent, or weaponized. A single line at the market, "The queen prefers millet to maize," could vault a trader into favor or exile. The court's appetites rewired entire economies. Women in peripheral towns learned to cultivate useful rumors. They traded them like spices, seeding narratives that could bloom into wealth or wither into punishment. And then there are the rituals. Those splendidly absurd devices societies invent to make power look orderly. Coronations featured displays intended to prove divine sanction. Drums beaten so loudly the neighbors called it a war. Dances meant to indicate harmony with the ancestral spirits. A parade of livestock and offerings that doubled as a public ledger of the state's consumption. Yet beneath the pageantry sat calculus: which clans received the best animals, which nobles got parades at the head of the procession, and which governor's son was asked to carry the king's stool for the day. Every ritual arranged a hierarchy of visible gratitude and hidden obligation. It was spectacle and bookkeeping at once, a public soap opera where the credits rolled in the pockets of those who placed themselves nearest to the screen. The politics of marriage also folded deeply into strategies of survival for women themselves. For wives, royal, noble, or concubine, marriage could be a ladder, a trap, a workshop for subterfuge, or sometimes all three simultaneously. Women learned to use the limited levers available: their children, their networks of kin, their knowledge of medicine and the seasons. They could become power brokers by sending a child to train with a general, or by arranging marriages that created new alliances. Sometimes survival meant the quiet accumulation of wealth in beads, livestock, or alliances with merchants who valued discretion. In a world where a single misstep could mean exile or worse, patience and invisibility were assets equal to courage. Yet the story is not one-sided. The men who navigated this world of many wives were not purely caricatures of lust and power. They were often men trapped by expectations too. A king must show his virility as proof of continuity. He must sustain alliances through marriage while retaining enough personal charisma to maintain fear and affection. If a monarch failed to produce an heir, or failed to entertain the flattery necessary for flattery to continue being effective, his rivals smelled the scent of weakness as a pack of hyenas smell blood. The king's life is a relentless performance. He must be a husband, a diplomat, a general, a judge, and frequently an unwilling actor in plays written by others. Survival in these courts often required alliances with unlikely partners. Eunuchs, for instance, though stripped of certain rights, often rose to positions of influence precisely because their hands were seen as safe, and their motivations less biologically competitive. The eunuch who controlled access to the sleeping quarters controlled gossip and could determine which whispers reached which ears. Servants who learned reading and accounts became invisible pillars of power. A cook who learned to prepare the one dish that brought the king to tears could switch the kingdom's policy with a well-timed lament. It was a system where positionality mattered more than pedigree. Being close to the heart meant being close to history. Let us not be naive. Cruelty and tragedy threaded through these narratives like a dark river, Behind every laugh in the throne hall, there were people who paid with their lives for a moment of royal amusement. Forced marriages consolidated power, but also displaced people from their land and homes. Wives sometimes came as hostages, bargaining chips offered by families desperate to survive raids or debt. Children born into palace life learned to distrust affection, to parse kindness as a strategy rather than a gift. The king's feasts were a spectacle of abundance that masked scarcities in the provinces, a public display that made famine invisible to those who only saw festival. In the peripheral villages, men who refused conscription for the king's wars were labeled cowardly, while the families who refused tribute were fined in ways that felt like punishment for breathing. And yet absurdity kept simmering at the edges. Take the story of a king who ordered that all clocks be removed from the palace because time was an insult. What can time offer the king but more wrinkles, while the rest of the kingdom still organized life by noon markets and moonlit planting? Cycles, or the monarch who demanded personal trophies from every visiting dignitary, a feather, a grain of rare salt, a song. Courtiers collected these items like badges, rewarding each other with symbolic trinkets that had little worth beyond their ceremonial value. It was a system that loved symbols almost more than outcomes. The court's humor, sharp and often cruel, became a survival skill. Satire disguised itself as poetry. A witty line about the king's sleeping habits could be a balm or a blade. Jesters and poets served as social pressure valves, allowed to speak truths otherwise dangerous when cloaked in verse. The wise fool could say aloud what others only whispered. Sometimes the fool's quip could diffuse a palace feud. Other times it could inflame it. A carefully targeted joke could be an antidote to disaster or its very ignition. Before we move to the inevitable betrayal that seems to follow every palace like a shadow, consider the private economies of love that coexisted with political marriages. Courting rituals, secret liaisons, and pragmatic friendships grew in hidden gardens and servant quarters. Lovers swapped knowledge for protection. Some unions were clandestine, built on stolen moons and quick promises. Others were pragmatic. A woman might trade a few nights and a steady stream of information for safe passage to her kin's village. These microeconomies of affection often shaped politics more than the public treaties. A love affair could produce a son who later becomes a king, or a lover who, having been spurned, becomes an architect of conspiracy. And then the inevitable fissure, jealousy, succession crises, famine, or a disgruntled general with more ambition than patience. These hotspots transformed domestic rivalries into civil wars. A displeased wife and her faction might approach a disgruntled provincial chief, promising seats, land, or marriage ties in exchange for soldiers. The kingdom, once a tapestry of negotiated peace, can unravel into a patchwork of competing sovereignties. In that unstitched reality, survival turns to choosing a side, often the side that promises the least immediate violence and the best long-term hope. People become adept at reading the winds. Which way are the traders moving their goods? Which village has fresh water? Where is the grain cheapest? In the end, survival frequently depended on prudence, the ability to move, and a willingness to serve a new master for as long as necessary. So here we stand, at the edge of the palace kitchen, peering into a cauldron where marriages and policies and rumors simmer into futures. You've seen the mechanics: marriages as treaties, women as strategists, princes as diplomats, rituals as ledgers, humor as weapon, and survival as an everyday art. But I promised you a tale of polygamy and power and the deliciously cruel games kings play. In the next moment, a piece falls off the board. Someone learns a secret, a son returns from exile, or a foreign envoy offers a marriage alliance wrapped in a jagged promise. Which tile moves next determines whether a dynasty will prosper or vanish like smoke under the noon sun. Now, before I leave you dangling on the palace parapet, type in the comments, who do you think will play the next move? The queen with the poisonous lullaby, the prince with a suspiciously calm smile, or the general with calloused hands and a ledger of debts? Tell me in the comments and pick a side. I might read the most dramatic reply in the next segment. Stay tuned. The chessboard is only getting stranger. A lullaby so sweet it makes a soldier weep becomes the murder weapon of a kingdom. A prince smiles like a calm sea while plotting like a storm, and a general counts loyalty the way accountants count cattle, slowly and with frightening accuracy. If you were the king, which would you fear most? Type lullaby, smile, or ledger in the comments. Pick your poison now. The palace woke the morning after the festival with a smell like burnt sugar and the hushed shuffling of people who had spent the night switching allegiances under candlelight. King Temba's crown sat heavy as a confession on his head. He moved through his day like a man with one hand in his pocket and the other holding a bomb. Word had grown teeth. Someone had sung the Queen's lullaby in the barracks, and half the soldiers wept and deserted their posts. The rumor said the lullaby was not merely melancholic. It contained a line, an enchantment of belonging that undid a man's ambition and left him pliant, loyal to the one who sang it. Whether enchantment or clever persuasion, the effect was the same. A ruler's army must be made of men who can forget homesickness at the trumpet's call. An army that weeps at bedtime is, practically speaking, a liability. Queen Aaliyah, called the serpent composer by those who loved her, and the serpentless by those who feared her, had indeed been friendly with lullabies. She collected songs like husbands collect estates, carefully, with an eye for how each piece might be used. In the nursery towers, she practiced harmonies that could sedate a child, and in the darker corridors, she practiced stories that could make a general confess his debts. It was said she had a jar of melodies she'd never sung in public, glass fragments of sound that could make a sworn enemy reframe his past. But the lullaby in the barracks was not one of hers, or so she claimed, to the exact right degree of indignation. Denial was a ritual too. Sometimes performance folds into politics until you cannot tell whether the tears were real or a carefully timed trick. Prince Kofi, meanwhile, moved like a man who had been learning how to be king in a school where the curriculum was cruelty and the homework was rumor. He took long walks through the palace gardens with a face so serene that court painters called it the calm before the scandal. He hosted poets who wrote elegies about loyalty, as if planting the idea of himself into the public ear. But peace is a strategy as dangerous as war. Those who promise calm are either geniuses or frauds, and men forgot to check which. Kofi cultivated relationships with provincial chiefs the way a vintner tends vines, patiently pruning where necessary, promising shade and tax breaks to those whose spears he wanted. His secret, the one he hid behind his smile, was that he had learned how to make stories feel inevitable. He would seed a rumor about a miraculous dream he'd had, a dream in which the ancestors pointed to him, and then let it drift like smoke into the market, where gossipers would give it form. The General Sefu, was the kind of man who thought in ledgers in which side of the ledger a man's loyalty should be recorded. He kept debts like trophies, names, numbers, promises inked into the memory of men who owed him favors. He had once marched an army through sand and rain for a promise of land, and he remembered the taste of that betrayal, like a small, bitter herb. Sefu's soldiers called him fair because he could be precisely wicked. A man who punished according to the size of a debt was a man who balanced cruelty with pragmatism. When whispers reached him that a lullaby had turned his troops into weeping sons, he took it as an accounting problem rather than a metaphysical one. Who paid? Who profited? Where were the lines of credit? He ordered audits of loyalty with the same hand that signed conscription orders. In the market, the lullaby became a commodity. Mothers hummed it to their infants as if invoking a charm. Shopkeepers used lines of its verses to soften sellers and raise prices by a teaspoon. The song leaked like oil through the fabric of the kingdom. In taverns it was hummed as a curse. In prayer circles it was recited as a blessing. In brothels it became a playful test. A client who wept at the chorus was either genuinely moved or deeply clever. Meanwhile, the palace scribes annotated the song in margins, the eunuchs who served the nursery copying it in tiny, neat hands that made it look like an official decree. You could trace the lullaby's migration across the city like a contagion. A rumor starts small, embroidered by the lonely, and becomes a law when enough people believe it. The concubine who mattered most in this episode was a woman named Amma. Not the brightest jewel at court, certainly not the highest born, but curious with a hunger for stories. She moved quietly and observed like a woman taking inventory of everything she might need to survive. Amma had once been a trader's daughter who sold beads at the market. She understood supply chains, human and material. To Amma, a lullaby was currency, an instrument you could trade if you knew the right acquaintance. One evening, with the gray light like an apology spilling across the palace roofs, she exchanged a line of the lullaby with a sergeant who tended the stables, in return for a favor. A message slipped into a dispatch to a neighboring chief. She did not know that the sergeant's cousin performed in the barracks that night, and the lullaby found its way into the soldiers' evening watch. Emma had not intended treason. She had intended a favor that would buy her a small house outside the city. Survival, in her mind, was practical and immediate, but survival is contagious and complicated. The chief who received the dispatch misread it or read it too charitably. He believed that Amma's message signaled an imminent change in the court. He tightened his alliances. The provincial chief's alignment shifted, and those beside him shifted in turn. Suddenly, a line in a lullaby had nudged loyalties at the border's edge. Trade caravans rerouted, favor changed hands, and a small village that had long supplied the royal kitchen with yams found its market emptier by half. The ripple grew, reaching the private storehouses that fed entire districts. When the storehouses slumped, famine was not far behind. Famine, when it arrives, is both blunt and theatrical. In the city, the first signs were subtle. Bread buyers who used to smile began to calculate the weight of loaf. Mothers who had always given the last portion to their children began to tuck it away. The king's feasts continued, ostentatious and obscene, because a sovereign's banquet is the visible proof of control. Yet the effects in the provinces were devastating. Governors who had mismanaged their territories for years found something harder to manage than tax receipts. Starving people who expected rescue. The court debated policy in silks that smelled faintly of oil-painted gold, while outside the palace gates the sound of gnawed bones and hollow bellies grew louder. Conspiracies bloom in the soil of hunger. The queen's enemies, who had already mistrusted her lullaby repertoire, claimed she had weaponized music to distract the troops so the court could steal grain from the provinces. Prince Kofi's supporters, ever practical, promised grain shipments to certain chiefs in exchange for oaths of fealty. General Safu, measuring everything by return on investment, began to maneuver as if the kingdom were a balance sheet to be reconciled. Each action created a counteraction. Ministers argued whether punishment or charity would better preserve the state. Priests offered rituals, auspices that would reassure the gods and perhaps the people. The public, starved for a narrative, accepted whichever explanation promised bread tomorrow. Then came the assassination attempt that reshaped everything. Not because it succeeded, but because it was messy enough to expose 10 different hands reaching into the same jar. A lantern exploded in the grand corridor the night the king passed by. Glass and oil and a confused eunuch on duty. Someone had planned to scorch a path in which the king would be seen as vulnerable, and vulnerability had always attracted vultures. The intended result might have been death. The actual result was scandal. The lantern bearer, a minor noble with more temper than sense, was charred and spoken of with pity. Fingers pointed everywhere. Queen Aliyah claimed the attempt was a clumsy stunt by jealous rivals. Prince Kofi murmured about outside agitators. General Sifu insisted it was the work of infiltrators paid by enemies beyond the border. If anything made conspiracies more interesting, it was the trial by spectacle the court chose to resolve suspicion. Instead of private investigations, the king demanded a public selection, a pageant of confession. The accused were paraded, their stories rehearsed by poets who found dramatic inspiration in accusation. Public spectacles were the state's favorite soap opera. They allowed the crown to stage justice while the people supplied the audience's moral outrage. But theatrical justice is a risky business. Performance can be manipulated. A script was written by men whose pens bled favor and whose ink preferred dramatic ends. The trial became a set piece where memories were polished and confessions curated like props. Those with the right patrons got roles, those without, scapegoats. Emma watched the spectacle from the shadow of a column, a small bead purse clenched against her ribs, and saw how little the court cared for the truth. The pageant told the story it needed. The lantern explosion was blamed on an outsider's hand so that the court could seem both threatened and righteous. The queen's lullaby, once a rumor of softness, hardened into evidence of manipulation. The generals called for firmer hands. The prince whispered about reconciliation and small reforms. The people, exhausted, accepted the narrative that offered food coupons and small comforts. Survival had become access to distribution lists and privileged granaries, and whoever controlled the lists controlled who lived. But survival is not only about who gets grain first, it is also about memory. The court's rewriting of events would make certain people into villains and others into saints. Amma knew, with the cold clarity of someone who has made a bargain for survival, that stories were fungible. She had traded a line of music for a favor, and in the theater of power, favors mutate into crimes. She realized that she could be the scapegoat, or she could be the author of a different narrative. Amma decided to tip the scales. Quietly, she began to meet with a disillusioned scribe who kept records in a ledger the king never saw. They met in a bakery with a window that looked onto the alley where gossip was traded for loaves, and there they wrote the version of events that no one dared speak aloud. The true path of the lullaby, the sergeant's unwitting transmission, the chief's misreading, the cargo ship that rerouted because of a bribe, even the lantern's true origin. It was a dry document, heavy as a legal brief and twice as risky. But for Amma, indicating truth on paper was a way to stake a claim on her future. This was the kind of work that could topple a dynasty or save a family. If Amma's ledger ever reached the right hands, it could undo an execution. It could expose the hypocrites who use spectacle to erase responsibility. But ledgers are weapons only when you can both read them and make others read them, and the palace's eyes were everywhere. Amma and the scribe would have to be cleverer than the spies who served as second eyes for the queen and the general alike. They would have to make their truth look like a rumor, slipping it into taverns and market stalls where the people would make of it a seed. You are watching a kingdom where whispers become policy and songs become law. You decide, again, who shaped the lantern plot. Was it the queen trying to stage vulnerability to expose her enemies? The prince testing the palace's loyalty? The general arranging a spectacle to tighten his audit of men's hearts? Or Amma, whose small trade spiraled into the politics of famine? Type who you think is behind the lantern. Queen, prince, general, or Amma? The most inventive reply might get a mention in the next episode. As night closed over the palace, men adjusted their armor like men who adjust their consciences, with the same mixture of reluctance and efficiency. A new council formed in the shadows, composed of those who had survived the banquet and feared the next course. They spoke little of honor and much of logistics, who controlled the storerooms, who had the keys, and who controlled the routes into the city. Plans were drawn in breadcrumbs and recited in lullabies. The lullaby, once a simple comfort, sat now at the center of an arithmetic too brutal to be poetic. Every verse could buy a man an ally or sell a child into debt. Aliyah tuned her voice to softer notes. Prince Kofi cultivated a friendlier face, and General Seifu sharpened his ledgers until the paper whispered danger. And Amma, the quiet bead seller turned invisible witness, tucked her ledger into a loaf's empty cavity and offered it to a messenger with cracked lips and loyal eyes, asking him to deliver it to a place whose name she whispered only once. The messenger took the loaf, and with every step his feet began to weigh more, the city's gravity shaped by rumors, famine, and the small metastases of power. The ledger would move, the story would spread, and the next morning the court would wake to a new smell in the air. A scent that could be freedom, or indictment, or simple panic. Clocks in the palace ticked on, though the king had demanded no clocks yesterday. Time, stubborn creature, kept its business. And somewhere beyond the palace gardens, a child sang a line from the lullaby, and no one could predict whether the song would soothe a soldier or seduce a conspiracy. The board had tilted, a single piece had moved. The next move would be uglier and smarter. Stay, watch, and write in the comments. Who will seize the ledger and which story will survive? A loaf is handed to a messenger, a ledger is hidden inside the bread, and the entire fate of a kingdom travels on crumbs. Because in the end, most empires are held together by hungry feet and poor bookkeeping. If you think saving a life is noble, type bread in the comments. If you think it's treason, type ledger. Pick your side. The morning the ledger made its clumsy pilgrimage, the city smelled of burnt tar and new decisions. Courtiers polished smiles like armor. The queen tuned her face to the frequency of scandal. Prince Kofi rehearsed a look of grief that could be filed under strategic modesty. General Seifu counted the days like a man counting coins, precise, stubborn, and with the occasional desire to misplace one to test whether anyone noticed. Amma's bread-trapped truth moved through alleys that ran like secret veins beneath the palace's ornamental skin. The messenger who carried it had been a stable boy once, a man whose hands had learned both the smell of horse sweat and the calculus of fear. He knew the value of silence, of pockets that could carry both gossip and grain. And he walked with the furtive dignity of someone carrying a story that might get him killed or paid. When the ledger reached its destination, it did not arrive at the courthouse or in the king's hands as Amma had imagined. Instead, it found the damp corner of a back room in a monastery-like house run by an exiled scribe known for two things: his hatred of spectacle and his tendency to drink tea at inconvenient hours. This scribe, Brother Mensah by the small label of faith and larger label of practical cynicism, read the ledger as a man reading weather patterns. He saw that the lullaby's migration was not merely a song, it was a vector leading from kitchen to army to storehouse. The ledger contained names and times, and those names were names of men who liked to sleep with doors open. It contained not only Amma's small exchange, but the chain of favors that had turned an idle hum into policy. Mensah tasted the truth and found it sourly useful. What he did next was the kind of move that historians later label clever and survivors label reckless. Mensah copied the ledger, not for the king or the queen, but for a handful of village chiefs who still understood the value of small graces. He sent duplicates on scraps of parchment, hidden in barrels of salted fish and in the bindings of a traveling minstrel's lute, so that those who stood at the edges of power could know how decisions at the center had eaten their food. The duplicates were messy, an extra line here, a miswritten name there, a prayer scribbled in the margin. They traveled like rumors in reverse, a flood moving from the palace outward. In the palace, life continued to be performative. The king insisted on breakfast that seemed to waver between indulgence and apology. He had become adept at eating as if he had been wronged, which made people both pity and fear him. Queen Aliyah practiced looking betrayed without ever looking weak. There are arts to public betrayal, and the queen had mastered them as any courtier learns to tie a double knot, quickly and with purpose. Prince Kofi pressed his calm smile into new shapes. He now knew how to look, as if one were weighing a nation's sorrow, rather than one's own appetite for the throne. General Sefu tightened his cord of influence like a belt. Men do not revolt against a belt that looks ready to buckle at a moment's notice. And yet, the duplicates, the poor man's ledgers, had been sewn into the sleeves of market women, wrapped in lovers' letters, shoved under loaves on the street that fed the city's poorest. Small chiefs read them aloud at grain exchanges and in council circles where the air was thick with bargaining. The effect was geometric. When two chiefs compared notes, they did not merely sigh, they began to act. They rerouted caravans away from the royal granaries, declared preferential trade with each other, or sent men to claim a bridge. The redistribution of small loyalties multiplied until a whole necklace of minor resistances wrenched a clasp loose on the kingdom's supply chain. The palace noticed. Not immediately. The instruments of empire are ludicrously capacious and slow to register small leaks. But when market prices shifted and the king's favorite cooks complained that some rare spice had been replaced with cheap root, the court convened a council. There, in the same hall where banquets had once doubled as debt ledgers, men argued about whether to punish misconduct or to adjust supply lines. The debate was a catalogue of privilege. Ministers suggested fines, generals suggested conscription, and a priest suggested that perhaps the gods were offended because no one had left offerings in the shrine that week. The king, who had always been a man of theatrical impulses, decided on both punishment and spectacle and asked for a trial that would please the city and frighten the disloyal. He wanted a punishment that could be watched. Watching in the king's mind was a weapon. A public denunciation could split a rumor into manageable pieces and reassign blame to a human face. The decision about where to place the finger of shame fell into a theater of absurdities. The queen suggested a scapegoat from the palace staff. The general wanted a minister who showed too much mercy. The prince, always fond of dramatic gestures, notched his voice in favor of a confession that would reveal outside plots and make him look like a savior. They chose a woman who had once been Amma's mentor, a midwife named Nalia who lived modestly and loved to write. Nalia's handwriting resembled a priest's in its neat severity, and she had been seen once at a market stall, where Uno, a trader, had whispered the lullaby to his children. That was enough. Nalia's arrest was both efficient and ritualized. Chains that clanked, a band of soldiers who talked too loudly, a stage set by men who believed that humiliation was better than rooting out the root cause. She was dragged through streets where children spat when they were told to show disdain, and where a few merchants threw in a coin for courage. In the square, the king pronounced that the nation had been betrayed and that order must be restored. The device of public shaming worked in small towns, and the built-in human pleasure of watching someone fall into disgrace gave the spectacle a tidy energy. For some, it was justice, for others, theatrical cruelty. Meanwhile, the duplicates continued to ripple. One such scrap reached the hands of a woman named Kessa, who had long been under the thumb of the king's tax collector. Kessa ran a small weaving co-op and had spent the winter rationing yarn. She read the page, saw the names, and understood instantly that the problem was not just music but policy shaped by greed. She did what small women do when large men break their lives. She organized. She spread the ledger's narrative in the market by weaving it into a tapestry of complaint. She handed out shawls printed with symbols that represented scarcity and stitched little runes that meant share. The shawls became a signal. Anyone wearing one at the granary line would speak to the clerk. Anyone speaking would learn a truth. Anyone learning would whisper to a neighbor. Networks made in this fashion are clumsy and beautiful. They are not conspiracies of generals, but rather a messy human algebra of survival. The palace's strength lay in centralized rituals, but its weakness lay in the human tendency to share bread with neighbors. When bread and truth move together, power becomes porous. General Seifu, who still believed that discipline could be audited into loyalty, sent patrols into the markets to seize shawls and arrest their wearers. Arresting shawl wearers has an unfortunate practical effect. It makes the movement look political instead of popular, and suddenly individuals like Kessa become symbols. When rulers chase symbols, they grant them immortality. The public reaction surprised the palace. What began as murmurs in the market swelled into a real, sustained resentment the third week after Nalia's arrest. People refused to stand for the first time during a procession. A baker closed his oven and refused to sell loaves to any official wearing a ceremonial sash. The court whispered about sedition and foreign meddling. The priests claimed omens, and the king's advisors argued for an iron hand. Yet the harder the crown squeezed, the more pressure built in the small towns. Men who had once accepted conscription started to ask for receipts. Governors who took bribes now worried about whether their sons could marry into honorable families. The ledger's lines, the dry names and times, slipped into the popular imagination as evidence of a deeper crime. Cruelty framed as necessity. At the heart of the palace, the power players reacted in the most human way. They argued. Aliyah and Kofi, who had staged separate and simultaneous gestures of piety, debated whether forgiveness might diffuse the movement or whether a decisive execution would terrorize it back under control. The general wanted a show of force, a parade of soldiers fed with food taken from the provinces to display both bounty and discipline. In a small, unremarkable room, they decided on both. The court would feed a select group of soldiers publicly and then demand that the market women hand over the shawls or face penalties. It was an attempt to combine benevolence and thuggishness, a mixture that predictably tastes foul in the mouth of the public. The plan cracked. Soldiers fed in the square ate mechanically, eyes avoiding the crowd. A mother shoved her shawl beneath her child, and when a soldier reached for it, the child kicked. A small human rebellion that looked absurd under the sunlight and moved like a contagion. Bystanders laughed, then they pushed, then they shouted. A soldier's hand slipped, and a shawl tore. When the general ordered his men to arrest the mother for assault, the soldiers hesitated. Hesitation is a virus that travels fast among men who are asked to harm their own neighbors. One soldier murmured to another about his sister. Another thought of the bread he had promised his children. The chain of command, so carefully maintained by General Sifu's ledgers, hit the living weirdness of human ties and began to fray. In those moments of friction, Amma's two decisions, to hide truth in bread and to ask a messenger to run, echoed in ways she had not imagined. She did not know of Kessa's shawls or Nalia's public humiliation when she tucked the ledger into the loaf. She had intended a small writing, a ledger that might make one chief reconsider a favor. Instead, she had lit a fuse that burned outward, and the city around the palace began to smell not only of tar and baked grain, but of a new possibility. Possibility is dangerous because it is noisy. It calls on the worst and the best parts of people. The court responded as courts do when faced with a truth they cannot entirely repress. They manufacture a narrative that makes everyone comfortable. They claimed that Nalia had confessed. They announced that the shawl wearers had been misled by malign foreigners who had paid them with counterfeit coins. State poets wrote odes to courage and duty until the people themselves began to recite them in the market without meaning to, like a hymn mouthed out of habit. Yet, the counterfeit coin story did not fit the farmers who had watched caravans divert away. It did not fit the mother who had been arrested. It did not fit the boy in the stable who had seen a ledger copy tucked into a lute. The narrative, however ornate, was thin when placed against the lived facts. On the third night after the public feeding, a different noise reached the palace. Not the loud thunder of war drums, but the low, persistent sound of people knocking on doors. Small groups of villagers, coalescing like frogs at dusk, came to the gates asking for audience. They did not bring banners. They brought not only complaints but also lists. Men's names who had delivered grain late. Men who had been promised offices and never received them. A woman who had died in childbirth because the midwife had been sent away. They wanted the ledger read aloud. The palace watched as its audience shifted from the ceremonial to the practical. This was the true terror. People no longer wanted a show. They wanted accountability. It was then that the court realized they had a new problem. Legitimacy no longer sat purely on the throne. Legitimacy had migrated into the market and returned with allies. The king's response was both classical and desperate. He offered a council, half chosen by himself and half by the provinces. He called for reconciliation and promised reforms he would later define as gradual. The public, exhausted by hunger and emboldened by solidarity, accepted the council not because they trusted the king, but because it offered a way to gain legitimacy through negotiation. If power is a feast, negotiation is a shared table. Prince Kofi, whose smile had always been his most dangerous tool, seized this moment to act like an honest broker. He stood in the square, not on a throne, and read aloud sections of Amma's ledger that had been circulated by Brother Mensa and embroidered by the market. He said nothing more than true facts, names, dates, exchanges, and when people heard them in his voice, they felt the thin curtain of performance tear. The prince's gesture was cunning. He did not point fingers at his mother or the general. He pointed at the system. "We will fix this," he promised, using a voice that suggested he might, horrifyingly, mean it. Queen Aaliyah, by then an expert in the theater of betrayal, watched Kofi's reading like a woman watching the weather. She understood that the prince had taken the ledger's moral authority and used it to build a platform of pragmatism. That platform could, with time, become a throne. She smiled in that slow, layered way queens smile when an army of incautious men march themselves into subtle traps. She did not move to stop him. Sometimes a monarch prefers to be outmaneuvered in public if the maneuverer will still stand behind the crown when storms come. Survival, after all, is partly about choosing which of your enemies you can count on tomorrow. General Sefu, however, had not yet learned the philosopher's art of graceful retreat. He tightened his grip and asked for the prince's arrest on charges of sedition. The request failed because the soldiers who had once feared his precise cruelty now had shawls in their brothers' houses and mothers among those who came to the gate. Orders do not travel as well through hearts as they do through ink. The general's command collapsed into a whisper and then into a rumor that he might be planning to seize the treasury. Rumors about treasuries are dangerous. They multiply quickly and often take the form of very practical acts, such as hiding grain in secret holes and putting money into the hands of friendly traders. By the time the sun rose on the 7th day, after Amma's ledger left the palace, the city had changed in ways small and irreversible. A woman who once traded gossip for beads now traded truth for bread. A prince who had practiced smiles had discovered that a public reading could be weaponized into a covenant. A general who loved ledgers found his numbers contested by human stories. As for Amma, she sat in a small house outside the city, weaving and waiting, not for reward or mercy, but for a world that made more sense to her children. She did not dream of crowns. She dreamed of a market where stories could be exchanged for honest coin, without men's faces changing when they heard them. This is not a tidy resolution, because history rarely offers tidy ends. The ledger did not topple the king in one night, nor did it save everyone. Some shawl wearers were punished. Nalia died in prison, remembered more for her handwriting than for her courage. But markets learned to keep receipts, and men who had once called themselves masters of a ledger began, for the first time, to fear the small networks that could undo their balance sheets. The city's politics became harder to manage because it had become human again. So tell me, Was the ledger a weapon of justice or a loaf of mischief? Type it justice if you think it did good, mischief if you think it did harm, or both if you accept that survival is ugly and necessary. The choices you make in the comments will feed the next episode's mood, punitive, hopeful, or just plain cynical. Pick wisely. The censors in the palace enjoy reading creative replies, and yes, there is more. The ledger's duplicates will surface in places no one expected: a governor's private chest, a soldier's lover's trunk, a temple wall where a prickly priest writes a footnote that will make a war seem personal. There are still men who sharpen knives in the dark, and women who sing lullabies into the cups of sleeping soldiers. The board is not reset, it is merely rearranged. The next piece to move could be kindness, or it could be a sword. Either way, the players have learned one grim lesson. Truth travels like bread, slow and warm, and when you hide it in a loaf, you either feed people or you starve them. The only real question left is who will claim the recipe. If you want the next chapter to be about a secret marriage, a poisoned banquet, or the ledger resurfacing in the hands of a child, type marriage, poison, or child below. The most creative choice will shape the next part, and I might read it out loud when the next episode premieres. 10 seconds. A child opens a drawer and finds a kingdom folded inside a loaf of bread, and then everyone argues about the crumbs. If you were that child, would you eat the bread or sell the secret? Type eat or sell in the comments and settle your moral stomach now. By dawn, the city had learned a new grammar: worry in the morning, bargaining by noon, and rumor at dusk. The ledger's duplicates no longer whispered like contraband. They marched through markets, clattered into taverns, and hung from the lips of mothers like warnings. The crown, once thunderous and obvious, found itself answering to a small, stubborn chorus of ordinary voices that knew the taste of scarcity. That chorus wanted two things: bread and names, and it wanted them in that order. Prince Kofi had tasted political triumph the way men taste sharp wine: thrilling, dizzying, and likely to give them a headache in the morning. His public reading of the ledger had been a gamble dressed as honesty. People liked to see their grievances translated into syllables and promises. They liked public figures who could say aloud what their neighbors already suspected. Kofi knew this language. He also knew how dangerous that language could be when spoken too often or too loudly. A man who reads lists of wrongs in a square of thousands is close to being a martyr if he likes a crowd too much. Queen Aaliyah watched the prince like someone watching a glass blower, fascinated by the shape he could make and anxious about how quickly heat might make him crack. Her strategy was to transform the spectacle into governance, to turn dramatic confession into dull committees and then into rules that no one would read. Rules, she believed, do the real work of pacification. Pageants only stop fighting for a week. So she proposed reform commissions whose minutes would be heavy with jargon and light on action. Her face, always practiced in expressions, wore the expression of a woman making peace with compromise. She would keep her lullabies for more private uses, and she would collect new songs that sounded sweet but encouraged patience. General Sefu, whose ledger had once given him dominion over men, learned perhaps the cruelest lesson. Numbers are not sacred when hunger redraws the margins of loyalty. He attempted to recalibrate authority the hard way, by seizing control of the town bridges and the granary keys, by asking his captains to block roads and search carts. For a week, his men executed orders with a competence that frightened the market. It should have worked, the logic of force usually does, but history and stubborn human tenderness take delight in small acts of disobedience. A ferry operator refused to let soldiers cross without paying the toll, and then refused the toll when the soldier's child began to cry. A granary clerk quietly miscounted sacks. A captain pocketed a handful of grain and became a small-time merchant the next day. Sefu's precise cruelty met the messy arithmetic of life and learned to be surprised. Amma, meanwhile, lived with a kind of fear that is quiet and watchful. She had not expected her bread to become doctrine. She had not wanted to start a movement. She wanted a house and safety for her children. Yet her small act of hiding a truth in plain food had given her an odd kind of notoriety. In alleys, she was either the woman who saved the city or the woman who ruined it. She had made real enemies who wanted to make examples of her, and real friends who would kill for her. Survival had taught her a modest skill set: to listen, to measure silver with a steady hand, to speak at the right decibel so the wrong ear did not catch the wrong thing. One night, Amma woke to the sound of someone at her door and did not immediately freeze. The city had taught her when to worry and when to act. A small boy stood there, cheeks raw from cold, a scrap of paper clutched like a talisman. It was a child of a soldier, the same soldier who had once been soot-streaked and loyal to a different ledger. "They ask if you're the one who hid the bread," the boy said. "They told me to ask if I could have your shawl." Children are excellent carriers of truth because adults expect them to lie less and listen more. Amma gave him her shawl. She could not keep it since she knew its use as signal and feared being sewn into another narrative. The boy ran back toward the gate with the innocence of someone who does not yet know how decisions map to consequences. The ledger's voice would not be silenced by shawls or speeches. It had entered the economy of the people like a new coin. Small chiefs used it to bargain for lower taxes. Mothers used it to petition midwives. Traders used it to demand receipts. Kessa's woven shawls, once simply defiance, became a textile vocabulary for dignity. Men who had never met one another began to exchange names and notes. Power, which once concentrated like oil, started to run along new channels. That was the real crime, and for some it was the only one worth condemning. As pressure mounted, the palace made a move that felt both old and modern. It reached for a scapegoat whose suffering could be displayed without the messy complications of public guilt. Nalia, the midwife with the priest's handwriting, had been arrested and thrown into prison. She had become the tragic punctuation that allowed the crown to call the story closed. Yet even her death, slow, official, and surrounded by antiseptic lies, did not stem the tide. The memory of her neat letters became a religious text of sorts among the market women. They transcribed her one-liners onto slips of cloth and tied them to bread ovens where women took turns watching each other's children. Martyrdom is a public good that no amount of money can buy. Kofi, in the meantime, had to decide whether he would take this moment to push forward or to build something sturdier. His public reading had made him a voice of accountability, but a voice is fragile without institutions to give it a backbone. He convened town meetings in marketplace shelters and listened to complaints. He did what a shrewd man of power does. He learned to speak without promising immediate miracles, and he learned to delegate shame. He appointed a council whose members included sullen but practical men from the provinces, women who had proved themselves in the market, and 2 eunuchs whose loyalty was low profile and high utility. He delegated the unsexy work, inventories, audits, lists, while preserving his role as the visible arbiter. This was clever politics. People like to see names put to sins and lists read aloud. It makes them feel seen. But justice built only on spectacle is a brittle thing. Kofi had to decide whether the ledger would be a weapon of retribution or a map for reform. He chose reform and got both applause and knives in return. Men who had held small offices found themselves on the wrong end of a public audit, their names read aloud like the indictment of a minor play. Some were dismissed, others humiliated, and a few paid in a way both literal and metaphorical. Coin for silence, positions for loyalty, marriages for reconciliation. The audience loved it because it was drama. History would remember it as the time power learned to manufacture consent. Some dangers could not be negotiated. General Sefu felt his authority slipping like a cloak in a cold wind, and he had a temperament to resolve problems with force. He plotted with men who preferred the arithmetic of swords to the subtleties of market signs. They planned to seize the treasury one moonless night, to lock the gates, and to declare a state of emergency. It was a common script in many courts. When the center felt shaky, make it impossible for dissent to coalesce by seizing the things that allow it to feed itself. In the corridors of the granary, knives were sharpened and plans folded into the night-like maps. Their attempt, predictably, did not account for the smallest, messiest variable: people. A granary raid succeeded only if the men who guarded it were wholly obedient, and men are rarely wholly obedient when their sisters are in the square and their children are starving. One captain, moved by the shawl a woman had once tied for his sister, refused to hand over the keys. Another refused because his neighbor had lent him seed the year before. The coup turned into a farce. Men argued in low voices, a lamp went out, and someone locked themselves in the wrong room with a sack of barley. In the end, the coup crumpled like a poorly built tent. Sefu was arrested, not publicly executed. The prince would not feed a crowd with blood, but confined to a house where his ledger could not be respected. He found himself outranked by gossip and denied the one tool he cherished, being able to write a man's worth in numbers. Power sometimes retreats in the most classic way, through boredom. When Sefu's men were paroled home with nothing but stories and fewer coins, they learned that being alive without a position was humbling. The palace, for its part, set new rules that made rebellion less profitable and more audacious, but also more embarrassing to attempt. Kofi's council wrote, in small bureaucratic language, a system of receipts for grain, a register of midwives, and clear rules about public feeding. It was practical, not poetic. It smelled of ink and the pleasant tedium of paperwork. The lion of spectacle lay down under the blanket of administration. People, exhausted, accepted this. They wanted bread that came without pageants. Ama watched all of this as one watches weather, with attention and the kind of resignation reserved for those who have known both drought and flood. She did not become a heroine in the big books, but she became one of those quiet, useful people whose faces appear in many small stories of recovery. Her house was not luxurious. Her children learned to read the ledger's odd numbers because their mother had found that literacy is a one-way ticket to stability. The scribe who had copied the ledger, Brother Mensa, became a minor clerk in Kofi's new administration, not because he wanted power, but because the work kept him away from bad ale and gossip. Kessa continued to weave shawls, though less as a fashion and more as a calling. She taught women to keep receipts and to name the men who took advantage of them. The market became a place for accounting as much as commerce. And yet, some things do not heal. Nalia's death could not be reversed. Certain names in the ledger had been punished in the meanest ways. The king kept his crown and a softened face that had practiced contrition until it looked sincere. He allowed reforms that shaved a little power from his general's hands and gave a little to the towns. He enjoyed meals that looked less ostentatious and more like concession. He kept his private lullabies for nights when he missed the comforts of being feared. The palace, like many institutions, learned the art of appearing to change while keeping most of its old habits. That, too, is a kind of survival. The city, however, had been altered in a way that was neither courtly nor entirely humane. Its people learned the value of small documents, of receipts and witnesses, of the strange dignity of being counted. They discovered that a ledger could be a tool of oppression or an instrument for fairness, depending on who wrote it and who read it. They learned to be suspicious of songs that made soldiers weep and grateful for songs that soothed children. They taught their children to hide important things in plain sight. A letter inside a loaf, a promise stitched into a shawl, an account kept in a child's exercise book. If this is a story about polygamy and power, then its true subject is something quieter. The human tendency to turn intimate acts into institutions and then forget what those institutions mean. Marriages had once been treaties. Now they were promises with paperwork. Queens and princes continued their private dramas, but the public had learned that monarchy is not the whole of society. People began to make alliances without crowns, baker to weaver, mother to midwife, trader to small chief. These alliances were messy and often merely practical, but they were also hard to conquer with the sword. There is an absurd moral to all this if you like morals. Kingdoms survive kings more often than kings survive kingdoms. That is not a comforting thought for a man who believes his line must shine forever, but it is a useful one for anyone who prefers practical security to eternal glory. The new order was neither perfect nor particularly glorious. It was full of compromise, small injustices, and the kind of honest paperwork that makes historians yawn, but it was also less lethal than the old one had been. So, the ledger ended not as a thunderbolt, but as a slow tide that rearranged stones. Some prominences were smoothed, some gullies deepened, new bridges were built by hands that had once been too busy stealing. It was not a revolution with flags and banners. It was a long negotiation of human needs. In the end, the child at Ama's door grew up to be a clerk who kept lists of who had been paid and who had not. He used the ledger's descendants to ensure that midwives got paid and that the king's messengers had receipts. He married a woman who wove patterns that still said, in embroidery, "Share." If you made it this far, pick one small thing to argue about in the comments. Was the ledger a miracle, a mischief, or a messy necessity? Type miracle, mischief, or necessary. I'll read the wilder answers out loud. And tell me, which character did you secretly root for? The prince with the actor's smile, the queen with the lullaby, the general who loved numbers, or Amma with her loaf. Type their name. The most unexpected pick gets a little backstory in the epilogue. Keep your answers salty. History likes to be entertained. Welcome, brave souls, to a journey through time, where the phrase "till death do us part" often felt less like a romantic promise and more like an immediate threat. We're peeling back the silken sheets of history to expose the cold, lumpy, and often crowded mattress of the historical wedding night. And trust me, it's lumpier than you can possibly imagine. Let's start our little tour of matrimonial misery in ancient Rome, a civilization that gave us aqueducts, concrete, and a level of public oversharing that would make a modern reality TV star blush. Now, you might picture a Roman wedding night as something out of a toga-clad epic, soft music, flowing wine, two lovers finally alone, and you would be spectacularly, hilariously wrong. First, let's talk about getting the bride to the bedroom. This wasn't a gentle, romantic carrying over the threshold situation. Oh no, this was a staged abduction. The bride had to be ceremonially stolen from her mother's arms, kicking and screaming for dramatic effect. Why? To honor the founding of Rome, of course, which, if you remember your history, involved a rather large-scale, non-consensual bride-napping event known as the Rape of the Sabine Women. So, on the most romantic night of your life, you're essentially reenacting a mass kidnapping. Charming, isn't it? It's like celebrating your anniversary by staging a fake argument about who forgot to take out the trash, but with more historical trauma. Once the pretend abduction was over, the bride was paraded through the streets in a massive procession. And I mean massive. Everyone you knew, and plenty of people you didn't, would be there, singing songs. And these weren't sweet lullabies. These were fescennine verses, crude, obscene, and deeply personal roasts of the happy couple. Imagine your drunkest uncle giving a wedding speech, but it's an entire neighborhood, and they've all been drinking since noon. They'd sing about the groom's supposed lack of stamina, the bride's weirdly shaped mole, and speculate wildly about what was about to happen behind closed doors. The idea was that all this mockery would ward off evil spirits, who would presumably be too busy laughing to cause any trouble. Or maybe the spirits just felt sorry for the couple. I'm leaning towards the latter. What's the most embarrassing thing someone said at your wedding? Let us know in the comments below. I'm sure it can't compete with having your fertility publicly questioned by a man named Gaius who smells of garlic and cheap wine. But we're not at the bedroom yet. Before she could enter her new home, the bride had to perform a series of rituals. She would anoint the doorposts with wolf fat. Yes, wolf fat, because nothing says welcome home like animal grease, and then be lifted over the threshold by the groom. This wasn't for romance, it was to prevent her from tripping. An ominous stumble was a terrible omen, suggesting the household gods were already displeased with her. So, no pressure. Just don't trip and doom your marriage from the start. Finally, they reached the bedroom. Alone at last? Don't be ridiculous. This is Rome. The party followed them inside. A group of matrons, experienced married women, would escort the bride into the lectus genialis, the marriage bed, which was, by the way, placed in the atrium, the most public room in the house. These matrons would then give her some last-minute advice. We can only imagine what that entailed. All right, Agrippina, remember to praise his, sword. And for Jupiter's sake, try not to look as terrified as you feel. Meanwhile, the groom is still outside with his buddies, who are probably still singing about his questionable virility. Only after the matrons left could he finally enter. And even then, the night was punctuated by the sounds of the party still raging right outside their probably curtained doorway. Privacy was not a concept they cherished. It was a community event from start to finish. The whole point wasn't love or intimacy. It was about creating a legitimate heir for the family. The love part could, hopefully, come later, much later, or never, whatever. As long as a baby was produced, the job was done. Now, if you think that sounds uncomfortably public, let's hop in our time machine and travel forward to the Middle Ages, where things got even more communal. Welcome to medieval Europe, a time of castles, plagues, and a baffling tradition known as bedding ceremonies. You see, for the nobility, a marriage wasn't just a personal union. It was a political and economic contract of immense importance, and like any contract, you needed witnesses to make sure it was properly sealed. And I mean that in the most literal, mortifying way possible. After the wedding feast, which was usually a multi-day affair involving questionable meat pies and enough ale to float a long ship, The grand finale was putting the bride and groom to bed, together, in front of everyone. Here's how it would go down. The entire wedding party, from the highest-ranking bishop to the lowest-ranking cousin, would escort the couple to their bedchamber. The priest would bless the bed, sprinkling it with holy water to banish any demons, or perhaps just the lingering smell of unwashed aristocrats. Then the bridesmaids would undress the bride, and the groomsmen would undress the groom, all while making lewd jokes and probably stealing their socks. Stripped down to their nightshirts, if they were lucky, the couple would be gently or not so gently pushed into bed. Then the guests would be offered one last drink from a cup of spiced wine or caudle, passed around the bed. This was the bedding cup, a final toast to the couple's fertility. And then they would all sit and watch. Yes, you heard me. Nobles, clergy, parents, siblings, they would all pull up a chair and wait for the marriage to be consummated. This wasn't about titillation, it was about verification. With alliances, inheritances, and sometimes the fate of kingdoms hanging in the balance, they needed absolute proof that the marriage was legally binding. And in an age before paperwork held all the power, the only surefire proof was a consummated union. If the groom couldn't perform, the marriage could be annulled. If the bride wasn't a virgin, the whole deal could be off. The pressure was immense. Imagine trying to be romantic with your dad, your new father-in-law, and the Archbishop of Canterbury staring at you, tapping their feet. It's the ultimate performance anxiety nightmare. Sometimes the curtains would be drawn around the bed for a sliver of privacy, but the guests remained in the room, listening for evidence of a successful union. Once the deed was considered done, the couple would emerge, and often the blood-stained wedding sheets would be triumphantly displayed the next morning as proof of the bride's virginity, the consummation. Public proof for everyone to inspect. Good morning, world. Here's some extremely personal biological evidence for you to scrutinize over your morning porridge. Let's be honest, who in their right mind would find this romantic? And more importantly, which historical wedding night do you think is the worst so far? The Roman reenactment of a kidnapping or the medieval public performance review? Cast your votes in the comments and let the historical horror show battle begin. But don't think for a second that this was only a problem for the rich and famous. While peasants didn't usually have the entire village hierarchy in their one-room hut, their wedding nights were far from private. In many parts of Europe, a charming little custom called the charivari, or shivare in North America, was popular. If the community disapproved of a marriage, say an old widower marrying a young woman, or two people of vastly different social standings, they would gather outside the couple's house on their wedding night and make as much noise as humanly possible. They'd bang pots and pans, shout insults, fire off guns, and generally cause a ruckus that would last all night long. The goal was to publicly shame the couple and show the village's displeasure. It was like the world's worst housewarming party thrown by people who hate you. The only way to make them stop was to pay them off with money or booze, essentially bribing your own community to let you have a moment's peace on your wedding night. And this wasn't just a one-off event. The charivari could last for days, even weeks, until the couple either paid up or fled the village in shame. So you've just gotten married, you're exhausted, you're trying to start a new life, and you have a mob of your neighbors outside, clanging cowbells and singing songs about how your new husband has no teeth. It's a beautiful start to a life together. Think about that for a moment. We worry about a little rain on our wedding day. These people had to worry about being publicly humiliated by a torch-wielding mob. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? Our modern anxieties about wedding planning seem almost quaint in comparison. Oh no, the calla lilies are wilted, versus oh no, the villagers are trying to break down the door with a log while questioning my husband's virility. The sheer lack of privacy is a theme we'll see again and again. In a world without central heating, people huddled together for warmth. In homes that were often just 1 or 2 rooms, the concept of a private bedroom was a luxury few could afford. Families often slept in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed. So, a wedding night might mean simply retreating to a corner of the room, while grandma, your parents, and a handful of siblings pretended to be asleep 3 feet away. And let's be honest, nobody was sleeping. They were listening, judging, probably taking notes. The very idea of marriage being primarily for love and companionship is a relatively modern invention. For most of human history, it was a practical arrangement. It was about survival, property, and procreation. The wedding night was the seal on that deal, the starting gun for the production of heirs and farmhands. Romance was a bonus, a lucky accident that might happen down the road if you weren't too busy trying to survive the next plague or famine. And it's in this context of practicality over passion that we find some of the most bizarre rituals. We've seen the public oversight of Rome and the witness sport of the Middle Ages, but what happens when we venture further afield? What about the Vikings? A culture known for its brutal warriors and epic sagas. Surely their wedding nights were simple, private affairs. Oh, you sweet, naive summer child, you have so much to learn. But that is a story for the next part of our descent into matrimonial madness. We've only just scratched the surface of the historical nightmare. Next time, we'll explore a world of ceremonial. Well, you'll have to subscribe and hit that notification bell to find out. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. For now, sleep tight and be grateful that the only witnesses to your private life are the FBI agent watching through your laptop camera and the algorithm tracking your every move. It's a step up, I promise. Welcome back, you brave connoisseurs of historical misery. If you're just joining us, we've already established that the historical wedding night was less about champagne and roses and more about performance anxiety and public scrutiny. We've endured the staged kidnappings of Rome and survived the medieval bedding ceremony, where your entire extended family became marriage consummation referees. If you thought that was bad, oh, you sweet thing, you have no idea what's coming. We ended last time by teasing the Vikings, a culture we associate with glorious beards, epic raids, and a certain straightforward brutality. So, what was their wedding night like? Did it involve axes? Possibly, but not in the way you think. Let's sail our longship into the icy fjords of the Norse world. A Viking wedding, or brudekaup, wasn't a one-day affair. It was a marathon of feasting, drinking, and hardcore legal negotiation. The marriage was, first and foremost, a contract between two families. The bride's family provided a dowry, and the groom's family paid a bride price. It was a merger and acquisition, but with more horned helmets and less PowerPoint. The wedding feast itself could last for days, a boisterous, mead-fueled event where sagas were sung and oaths were sworn. But the main event, the legally binding part, came at the end. After days of drinking, the couple had to be officially put to bed. But first, the rituals. The bride would be led to the bed by her mother and other female relatives, while the groom was accompanied by his father and the boys. There was a ceremonial bride running or brudekaup, where the bride and groom would race to bed, a symbolic gesture of eagerness. Once there, however, it wasn't a private party. Key witnesses, usually the parents and a few other respected members of the clan, had to be present to see the couple get into bed together. This was the final legally required step to prove the marriage had taken place. They didn't necessarily stay to watch the whole, negotiation. The Vikings, for all their bluster, were slightly more practical and less theatrically creepy than the French nobles we'll meet later. They just needed to witness the couple being in the bed, under the same blanket. It was like having a notary public stamp your documents, but the document is your bed, and the notary is a 7-foot-tall man named Bjorn, who smells faintly of fish and violence. In the bed itself, in a classic longhouse, which was essentially one giant smoky room where the whole family and probably their livestock lived, privacy was a myth. The marriage bed would likely be a small enclosed alcove, but everyone was still right there, breathing, snoring, listening. The sound of a cow mooing in the corner really sets a romantic mood, doesn't it? The goal wasn't passion, it was production. The sooner a child was on the way, the more secure the alliance between the two families. The wedding night was the starting whistle for the air-making factory. It was a job, a very important, very public job. No time for romance when there are clan politics and fishing seasons to consider. But what if the terror on your wedding night wasn't from the people you could see, but from the ones you couldn't? Let's drift down the Nile to ancient Egypt, a civilization obsessed with death, cats, and eyeliner. You'd think a culture that built the pyramids would have some ridiculously complex and public wedding ceremony. And you'd be wrong. For common Egyptians, getting married was shockingly simple. There was no big state or religious ceremony. A woman simply packed her things and moved into her husband's house. That was it. They were married. It was basically the ancient equivalent of changing your relationship status on social media. So, their wedding night must have been a blissfully private affair, right? Finally, a culture that gets it. Well, yes and no. While they may have been physically alone, Their bedroom was one of the most crowded places imaginable. It was just crowded with gods, demons, and a whole lot of magical anxiety. The Egyptians believed the world was swarming with invisible forces, many of them malevolent, who would love nothing more than to ruin your day, or in this case, your marriage. The wedding night, a moment of profound transition and vulnerability, was a prime target for supernatural mischief. So, the Egyptian wedding night was less about intimacy and more about magical warfare. The couple wouldn't have been surrounded by relatives, but by an arsenal of protective spells and talismans. They would wear amulets to ward off evil spirits. The bed itself would be carved with protective symbols. They would likely invoke the protection of specific deities. Chief among them was Bes, the delightfully ugly dwarf god. He was a protector of households, mothers, and children, and his main job was to scare away demons with his terrifying appearance and loud noises. So while you're trying to get close to your new spouse, you're also hoping a ferocious-looking dwarf god is doing his bouncer duty at the supernatural door to your bedroom. And the goal was, as always, fertility. But in Egypt, fertility was a magical battle. If a couple had trouble conceiving, it wasn't a biological issue. It was a curse or a hostile spirit squatting in the womb. So, the wedding night was the first and most important ritual to get the magic right. They would use fertility charms, recite incantations, and maybe even consume special foods believed to promote conception. It was a night spent not just with a new partner, but with an entire pantheon of divine helpers and a legion of demonic party crashers. Which do you think is worse? A room full of your living, breathing, judging in-laws, or a room you hope is full of friendly gods fighting off invisible, baby-stealing demons? Let me know your nightmare fuel of choice in the comments. Now, let's leave the magical anxieties of the desert and leap forward to a place that combined the public spectacle of the Middle Ages with a level of theatrical absurdity all its own. Welcome to 17th and 18th century France, specifically the glittering, rotting cesspool of opulence that was the Palace of Versailles. For the French aristocracy, life was performance. Every single action, from waking up in the morning to relieving oneself, was a public ritual governed by a complex set of rules called etiquette, and the wedding night was the ultimate premiere. Privacy was a concept for peasants. For a duke and duchess, their union was a matter of state and, more importantly, a matter of status. Let's picture the scene. The bride has been corseted within an inch of her life, unable to take a full breath for the last 12 hours. Her hair is a powdered mountain, 3 feet high, decorated with pearls, feathers, and possibly a model ship, because why not? The groom is similarly encased in silk, lace, and an air of profound boredom. They've endured a day of mind-numbing ceremony, and now it's time for bed. The entire court, or at least those of a high enough rank to merit an invitation, would cram into the ridiculously ornate bedchamber. This wasn't some grim legal duty like in medieval times. Oh no, this was the hottest ticket in town. Being there was a sign of your social importance. You would jostle for a position with a good view, gossiping with other dukes and countesses about the bride's dowry and the groom's rumored gambling debts. The king himself might even be there. Louis XIV, the Sun King, turned his own bedtime and waking rituals, the cowsher and lever, into the central events of the court's day. It was only natural that the consummation of a major noble marriage would also be a spectator sport. The bride and groom would be ceremonially undressed, not by lowly servants, but by the highest-ranking people in the room. A duchess might have the honor of removing the bride's garter, while a prince of the blood might get to hand the groom his nightshirt. Every action was freighted with meaning and prestige. Then, they were put into the bed, a monstrous canopied structure that looked more like a theatrical stage than a piece of furniture. The curtains would be drawn, but the audience remained. They would drink and talk and listen. And unlike the stoic Vikings or the grimly dutiful medievals, the French court was all about the witty, cutting commentary. You could hear them whispering right outside the curtains. Did you see the look on her face? I give it 5 minutes. He looks rather pale, doesn't he? It was a live tweeted event, but with more syphilis and less electricity. The pressure was not just to consummate the marriage for legal reasons, but to do so in a way that didn't become a source of court gossip for the next decade. It was the ultimate test of grace under pressure, where the pressure was a room full of the most powerful and bitchy people in Europe. After a suitable amount of time, a servant might bring them refreshments, and the next morning, the state of the sheets was still a matter of public interest. This was the absolute peak of the bedroom as a public reception room concept. Your most private moment was a piece of public theater, another scene in the endless, exhausting play of court life. It wasn't about love, or even just about heirs. It was about reinforcing the social order, where the bodies of the nobility were public property, their functions and dysfunctions a source of entertainment and political maneuvering for the entire elite. So far, we've seen wedding nights as legal contracts, magical battlegrounds, and public performances. We've been watched by nosy relatives, invisible demons, and powdered aristocrats. And through it all, the poor couple at the center of it is just trying to get through the night without dying of embarrassment or being cursed by an ancient spirit. But believe it or not, we have not yet reached the pinnacle of matrimonial weirdness. We haven't even touched on the bizarre superstitions that govern the first night for common folk across the globe, or what happened when royal duty required some truly strange proofs of fertility. Next time, we're going to get even more personal. We'll explore the world of folk magic, where a piece of wedding cake under your pillow is the least of your worries. We'll look at traditions that involved livestock, shoes, and some very creative uses for stockings. And we will witness what might be the most awkward royal wedding night in all of history, a story so cringeworthy it makes the French court look like a bastion of privacy and good taste. You thought it was bad? We're just getting warmed up. Make sure you're subscribed, because the nightmare is about to get a whole lot weirder. Alright, you survivors, you historical horror aficionados, welcome back. You've waited with us through the public humiliations of Rome. You've endured the witness stand as a marriage bed of the Middle Ages. You've sailed with the legally minded Vikings. You've battled Egyptian demons, and you've stood uncomfortably in the corner of a French aristocrat's bedroom. By now, you should have a healthy appreciation for your modern mattress and the glorious invention of the lockable door. You probably think you've seen the worst humanity has to offer in the name of matrimonial bliss. You are, of course, delightfully wrong. So far, we've mostly focused on the upper crust, the kings and nobles whose lives were public record because they were essentially public property. But what about the common folk, the 99%? Did they escape this nightmare? Did they get to enjoy quiet, simple wedding nights, free from the prying eyes of the community? Oh, you sweet, innocent fool. The answer is a resounding, cacophonous no. In fact, for ordinary people, the wedding night was a chaotic gauntlet of superstition, folk magic, and deeply weird community participation. Welcome to the grassroots level of historical misery. Let's start with a tradition that sounds almost quaint until you really think about it, the wedding stocking. In the 16th and 17th century Britain, after the couple was ceremonially put to bed, the real fun began. The bridesmaids would gather on the bride's side of the bed and the groomsmen on the groom's. Then they would all take off their stockings. The groomsmen would turn their backs to the bed and one by one throw their stockings over their shoulders, aiming for the bride's head. The bridesmaids would do the same, aiming for the groom. The belief was that the first person to successfully land a stocking on the opposite spouse's head would be the next one to get married. Now, picture this scene. You are finally in bed with your new spouse, exhausted, the room is probably cold, and suddenly you are under assault from an aerial bombardment of sweaty woolen hosiery, hurled by your drunkest friends. It's like a game of dodgeball you can't win, where the prize is not getting hit in the face with your cousin's foot sheath. Romance is truly dead, bludgeoned to death by a well-aimed sock. What's the weirdest thing a guest did at your wedding? I guarantee it did not involve using your head for target practice with their laundry. Or did it? Let us know in the comments. We're not here to judge, only to be entertained by your trauma. But the projectiles didn't stop there. An even older tradition involved shoes. As the couple departed for their new home, guests would throw shoes at them or at their carriage. This was meant to be a gesture of good luck, a symbolic transfer of authority from the bride's father to the groom. But let's be practical. It's a bunch of people, again, probably drunk, throwing hard leather objects at you. It's less good luck and more good luck not getting a concussion. This is the likely origin of tying old shoes to the back of the wedding car, a modern tradition that thankfully removed the element of high-velocity head trauma. Once you survived the barrage of footwear and hosiery and finally made it inside your new home, the night was still governed by 1,000 tiny, terrifying superstitions. The world was a scary place, filled with bad luck, evil eyes, and witches who might want to curse your fertility, just for fun. So your wedding night was your first, best chance to fortify your new life against all that bad juju. Salt might be sprinkled across the threshold to keep evil spirits out. Certain herbs like rosemary for fidelity or myrtle for love would be tucked under the pillows or woven into the mattress. The bed itself might have been made from a specific type of wood, like ash, believed to have protective properties. Every single detail was a desperate plea to the universe. Please, let us have healthy children and don't let our cow die. And speaking of cows, let's talk about animals. We mentioned the livestock sharing your living space in a Viking longhouse, but in many folk traditions, animals were active participants in the wedding night's magical proceedings. In some parts of rural Europe, a chicken might be decapitated on the threshold. The way its headless body flopped around was considered a vital omen for the future of the marriage. A vigorous flop? Excellent, a fertile and passionate union awaits. A lazy, uninspired flop? Well, better luck next time, I guess. Imagine your whole future being decided by the death throes of a breakfast food. It's like a Ouija board, but with more blood and feathers. The wedding night wasn't an escape from the daily grind of peasant life. It was a hyper-condensed version of it. It was about practicality, property, and superstition. It was loud, it was crowded, and it was deeply, deeply weird. The very idea of it being a private, romantic moment was a fantasy that simply did not exist for most people. But let's not let the common folk have all the fun. Let's swing the pendulum back to the royals, because when a royal wedding night goes wrong, it goes wrong on a spectacular, internationally humiliating scale. And there is perhaps no greater example of this than the calamitous first night of King Henry VIII of England and his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. This, my friends, is a masterclass in historical awkwardness. The year is 1540. Henry, now a bloated, paranoid, and increasingly grumpy middle-aged monarch, needs a new wife for political reasons. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, arranges a match with a German princess, Anne of Cleves. Cromwell, relying on a very, very flattering portrait painted by Hans Holbein, sells Anne to the king as a great beauty. It's the 16th century equivalent of using a heavily filtered photo on your dating profile. Henry, excited to meet his beautiful new bride, decides to surprise her by showing up in disguise before their official meeting. It does not go well. Anne, who doesn't speak English and has no idea who this large, greasy man bursting into her chambers is polite but unimpressed. Henry is horrified. The woman from the painting is not the woman standing before him. He famously and cruelly dubbed her the Flanders mare. But the political wheels were already in motion. He couldn't back out. He had to marry her. The wedding day was by all accounts excruciatingly tense. Henry was in a foul mood, but the true disaster was the wedding night. Here you have the most powerful man in England, a king whose ego was as large as his considerable girth, legally obligated to consummate his marriage to a woman he found physically repulsive. And we know exactly what happened. Why? Because Henry, in his desperate attempt to have the marriage annulled, told everyone about it in graphic detail. He complained to his doctors and ministers that when he went to bed with her, he found her body to be disordered and indisposed to excite and provoke any lust. He told them he was so disgusted by her appearance that he left her as good a maid as he found her. He shared intimate details about her body, speculating about her virginity with the kind of crude locker room talk you wouldn't expect from a king, but absolutely should from Henry VIII. Imagine being Anne of Cleves. You've been shipped off to a foreign country to marry a man who looks like an angry, aging thumb. He clearly despises you. You have to lie in bed next to him while he presumably sighs heavily and thinks of England. And then, the next morning, you discover that your husband is running around the palace, telling the entire government that you are too ugly to sleep with. The sheer, soul-crushing humiliation is hard to fathom. This wasn't just a private failure. It was a matter of state. A king's inability to produce an heir, or even to perform the act required to produce one, was a political crisis. Henry's public announcement of his non-consummation was a calculated legal move, a way to void the contract, but it remains one of history's most spectacular examples of a wedding night going disastrously, publicly wrong. It's the ultimate, it's not you, it's me, except it's definitely you, and I'm telling all my friends. So, who had it worse? The peasant couple getting socks thrown at their heads, or the queen being publicly shamed by her own husband for his royal impotence? It's a tough call. But if you think a king publicly announcing his own bedroom failures is the absolute peak of wedding night absurdity, you are in for a treat. because we have saved the most bizarre, the most invasive, and the most medically eyebrow-raising story for last. In our final installment, we will journey to a royal court where the consummation of a marriage required not just witnesses, but assistants. A story so strange it will make you question everything you thought you knew about biology, royalty, and basic human dignity. Prepare yourselves. The grand finale of historical wedding night horror is coming, and it will not be pretty. And so, we have arrived. The final circle of our historical hellscape. You have survived the public gaze, the thrown stockings, the royal temper tantrums, and the demonic anxieties. You have proven your mettle. Welcome, dear viewers, to the grand finale, the final act in our tragic comedy of historical wedding nights. We have saved the most unbelievable, the most invasive, and frankly, the most clinically baffling story for last. Before we get to the main event, let's set the mood with one last dive into the murky waters where medicine and magic bled into one another. In a world before modern science, the mechanics of procreation were fuzzy, to say the least. They were a black box of superstition, guesswork, and terrible, terrible advice. A wedding night wasn't just about consummation, it was about aligning the humors, appeasing the spirits, and following a biological roadmap drawn by a blind man. For centuries, doctors and folk healers alike peddled bizarre theories. A child's gender, for example, was thought to be determined by which testicle the man's seed came from. The right for a boy, the left for a girl. This led to some truly desperate measures, with aspiring fathers going so far as to tie off one testicle before heading to the marriage bed, hoping to guarantee a male heir. It's a bold strategy. Let's see if it pays off, Cotton. Spoiler alert, it did not. It just led to a lot of uncomfortable, one-sided shuffling. And the advice for the bride? Even worse. She was told to be passionate, but not too passionate, lest the heat of her excitement damage the delicate seed. She should lie on her right side after the act to conceive a boy. She should eat certain foods, avoid others, and time the entire event with the phases of the moon and the alignment of the stars. The wedding night was less a moment of intimacy and more a high-stakes laboratory experiment, where all the equipment was faulty and the instruction manual was written in gibberish. You weren't just joining with your new spouse, you were doing battle with your own baffling anatomy, guided by the best medical minds of the 14th century, who were still arguing about whether or not flies were spontaneously generated from rotting meat. This blend of public pressure, political stakes, and profound medical ignorance creates the perfect storm for our final story. A story so long, so drawn out, and so deeply personally humiliating that it makes Henry VIII's complaints about Anne of Cleves look like a minor grumble. We return to France, the undisputed champions of public bedroom rituals. But this time, it's not about performance. It's about a catastrophic 7-year-long failure to launch. Let me introduce you to the wedding night of the future King Louis XVI of France and a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess named Marie Antoinette. The year is 1770. The marriage is the political event of the century, designed to seal an alliance between the two great rival powers of Europe, the Bourbons of France and the Habsburgs of Austria. The stakes could not be higher. On one side, you have Louis, the 15-year-old Dauphin. He's shy, studious, and would rather be tinkering with locks than dealing with people. On the other, Marie Antoinette, a bubbly, naive teenager who has been ripped from her home and thrust onto the biggest stage in the world. They were two children, burdened with the expectation of producing an heir to secure the future of a continent. The wedding day itself was a classic Versailles spectacle. Opulence stripped from every surface. The couple met for the first time just days before. After the ceremony and the feast, it was time for the time-honored, horrifying ritual of the public bedding. The king, Louis XV, gave the groom his nightshirt. The Duchesse de Chartres gave the bride hers. The entire court crammed into the bedroom to watch the two awkward teenagers get into bed together. The Archbishop of Reims blessed the bed. The curtains were drawn. The court finally left. And then, nothing. And nothing the next night. And nothing for the next week, the next month, the next year. For 7 solid years, the most important marriage in Europe went unconsummated. 7 years. Can you even begin to imagine the pressure? The sheer, unrelenting humiliation? This wasn't a private matter. It was a state secret that everyone knew. The court gossiped endlessly. Cruel jokes and obscene pamphlets circulated through Paris. mocking the king as impotent and the queen as a useless Austrian who couldn't do her one job. The most intense pressure came from Marie Antoinette's mother, the formidable Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. She wrote a constant stream of letters to her daughter, letters that were less motherly advice and more a ruthless interrogation. "You are both very young, but I must confess that I am deeply worried," she'd write, demanding intimate details. "Are you fulfilling your conjugal duties? Are you showing him affection? Are you even trying?" She blamed her daughter, the court, the French food, anything and everything for this failure. Every courier from Vienna brought another wave of maternal disappointment and political panic. Meanwhile, poor Louis was completely lost. He was a deeply religious and timid boy who likely had no idea what he was supposed to be doing and was terrified of failing. So he did what he did best. He avoided the problem. He'd go hunting early in the morning and come back late at night, exhausted, and fall asleep immediately, leaving his young wife alone and miserable. It was a perfect storm of teenage awkwardness, sexual ignorance, and crippling performance anxiety, all playing out under the unblinking eye of European politics. So where, you ask, does the promised assistance come in? After 7 years of this agonizing failure, the family decided to intervene directly. In 1777, Marie Antoinette's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, came to visit Versailles. His mission, under the guise of a state visit, was to figure out what in God's name was wrong with his sister and brother-in-law. He was there to be history's most high-stakes marriage counselor. Joseph sat them both down, separately. He found his sister flighty and absorbed in the frivolities of the court, and his brother-in-law a well-meaning weakling. In a frank man-to-man talk that is one of the most surreal moments in diplomatic history, he finally got to the root of the problem. Louis suffered from a medical condition called phimosis, where the foreskin is too tight, making arousal and the act itself painful and difficult. It was a simple physical issue, solvable with a minor surgical procedure. But the young king, terrified of the knife, had refused. Joseph also noted that Louis was simply unskilled, going about the act with all the enthusiasm and finesse of a man trying to assemble flat-pack furniture without the instructions. So the assistance was twofold. It was the stern brotherly lecture from an emperor who bluntly told Louis to get over his fears and do his duty. And it was the successful surgical intervention that finally, after 7 agonizing years, fixed the physical problem. Shortly after Joseph's visit, history was made. The marriage was consummated. A year later, Marie Antoinette gave birth to their first child. The kingdom celebrated. The alliance was secure, but the damage was done. The 7-year joke had cemented their image in the public mind. A weak, impotent king and a frivolous foreign queen, a couple out of touch with reality. It was a personal failure that fed directly into the political resentments that would, just over a decade later, lead them both to the guillotine. Their wedding night didn't end after one night. It dragged on for 7 years, and its catastrophic fallout ultimately cost them their heads. And there you have it. From public viewings to flying stockings, from demonic warfare to royal impotence clinics, the historical wedding night was, for most people, a trial to be survived, not a moment to be cherished. It was a legal, political, and social crucible where the private anxieties of 2 people were magnified into a public spectacle. It was a world where privacy was a fantasy and romance was an afterthought. So tonight, when you close your bedroom door, take a moment, savor the silence, appreciate the solid, unblessed, non-demon-infested wood. Be grateful that your in-laws are in the living room and not pulling up a chair by your bedside. Be thankful that your fertility is a matter for you, your partner, and maybe a doctor you choose, not a subject of debate in the halls of government. We live in an age of romantic expectation, but we have forgotten the sheer, brutal practicality of the past. Our greatest wedding night fear might be a bad playlist or a clumsy first kiss. Theirs was a curse, a concussion from a flying shoe, or the complete and utter collapse of a political alliance. It truly gives a new meaning to the phrase, a night to remember. What do you think was the most important thing they were missing on these historical wedding nights? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this descent into matrimonial madness. Sleep tight and lock the door.